Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
I took care of your disabled father for 10 years, and now that he is gone, he decided to get rid of me like a piece of junk. The woman's outrage was unparalleled. I gave up my favorite job, postponed the birth of our children, and all for your sake, so that you could continue to advance in your career, and you, scoundrel, found another. Not only that, but she has a child with you. Claire grabbed her purse and ran out of the apartment. Claire and Jordan had been married for 10 years. They met at a college party and never separated again. "I'll pick you up tomorrow." The first night they met, Jordan said boldly, "Yeah, come by." Claire readily agreed. Every morning a whistle sounded under her window, followed by a not-too-loud whistle. "Claire, the carriage is here." Looking up to Claire's window on the 5th floor, Jordan was already standing below, with a briefcase under his armpit. Just then, Claire's black head, with its wavy curls, appeared in the open flame and her usual, now Jordan." 3 minutes later, Claire would jump out of the doorway, and the long Jordan would take another briefcase, a girl's briefcase, under her armpit. They returned from class together, too. 6 months of meetings were enough for them to realize that they were made for each other. "Where are you going, to the library?" Claire asked her cheerful classmate. "Yeah, you." "Are you going there, too?" And the young people walked together. "Shall we go to the movies?" suggested Jordan, and I was just dreaming of a new movie. Claire was excited. Movies, books, and music, they liked the same things, or almost the same things. Even in the student cafeteria, everything was resolved to the advantage of both of them. He loved the crumb of bread, she the crusts, and by ordering the vinaigrette, Claire always knew that the peas, which she couldn't stand, would be sparingly eaten by Jordan. "Just look at these misers. It's a natural plushkin with a box. They have every trip to the canteen so profitable." Their buddies laughed, pointing their fingers at the couple. Even with the current abundance of everything in the stores, it was not difficult. Christopher, his son and daughter-in-law, did all his errands perfectly. He was content, although he was very sad after the sudden death of his wife 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack. He had grown fond of the cheerful, troublesome daughter-in-law. "Claire, you look so much like Jordan, Mama," he told her often. "Just as troublesome and never angry. And my Betty, she was just as easygoing." Claire would rush to hug a sad Christopher. Come on now. Come on, it's all right, we're here." The elderly man tried to discreetly wipe away involuntary tears, and soon got used to the lightning visits of Claire, who, whirlwind carried around his small apartment, immediately put it in order. "Christopher," she shouted from his bedroom, "do you want that old shabby chair? Why don't we throw it away, and Jordan will bring you a new one tomorrow?" Christopher instantly forgot about the sadness and ran as hard as he could to save his favorite chair, as old and dilapidated as he was. Next time, as soon as her father-in-law's mood became sad, she again found something just as precious and frightened him with the expulsion of the precious object to the garbage. The father-in-law piously believed that his daughter-in-law's efforts were caused solely by her love of order and new things. He didn't realize how Claire was laughingly telling her husband in the evening, "Do you know how she scared Daddy today? He's sitting there looking at an old picture, you know. Remember your mom? Oh, come again. He was upset. You know, he loved Mom very much." "Yeah, I know." Claire stopped him. "I wanted to distract him. I frightened him with the chair that time, and today I threatened to throw away the antique clock, the one that doesn't work, and my father was so angry with me before I left. Young people nowadays don't understand anything about good things. Young people just want to spend money, and the chair will last 100 years. Oh, he can do that. He smiled at Jordan. I can imagine how many hours he grumbled when you left. Let him. Claire waved her hand lightly. At least he didn't sit around crying and crying. A little stress improves his vitality, but dinner must have calmed him down, said Jordan, leaning back in his chair and stroking his stomach. You've never cooked as good as you did tonight, Claire. Satisfied Claire smiled contentedly and immediately commanded, I didn't cook for nothing. I was counting on your help. The dishes are yours. Get to the sink now, come on. Of course, it was purely symbolic labor, washing dishes after a delicious dinner, but my wife was pleased. She was spinning around, serving, then a fork, then a spoon, then wiping everything washed clean, and putting it in its place. Not work, but pure pleasure, the continuation of communication, all the more joyful that now the couple did not see each other during the day. Claire came home early from her work, so that she took care of her father-in-law more and more often. Everything flowed smoothly until one day Claire was interrupted from work by a call from Jordan. Claire. He was almost shouting into the phone. Dad's having a stroke. My neighbor Clara called me. She's already called an ambulance, but I can't leave. I have a meeting with the Chinese in 10 minutes, you know. I'll be right there. Claire got right to the point. I'm on my way. I'll call you later. And she was already rushing down the corridor to warn her superiors, putting on her coat and forgetting about her boots. And so she arrived at the hospital. Only getting out of the cab, she saw that she would have to walk through the puddles in her shoes. Confused, she stood by the car, not knowing where to go. I'm sorry. The cab driver waved his hands. You can't go any further? You see the barrier? Claire looked at him uncomprehendingly and silently walked forward, looking for the main entrance with her eyes. She was in a hurry, as if something depended on her there, in the ward where Christopher was. Only at the emergency room did Claire realize that she would not be allowed into any room. Stroke patients were taken to the intensive care unit while it was still possible to prevent major complications from the stroke. There was no way anyone would be allowed in. The confused Claire, holding her coat in her hands, stood at the door to the intensive care unit for so long that the nurses and orderlies who ran by began to squint at her. Finally, one of them, touched by Claire's lost look, stopped and asked, What are you waiting for, woman? We have father here, and began to explain that she and her husband were at work, that they had been told about the intensive care unit, and that she didn't know what to do. What is the name of the patient? With a brief nod, the nurse left, and soon the doctor, a tall, stern brunette, came out of the ward. Well, who's here? She said her father-in-law's name, although there was only one Claire in the hallway. Me, how is he? Is he alive? Claire bailed. He's alive if he's here. The doctor replied in a low voice, What are you, his daughter? A daughter-in-law, but still a daughter. Claire said hurriedly, as if something depended on her words. Your father suffered an ischemic stroke, and he's still in serious condition. Leave your phone number so I can contact you at any time. Could it get any worse? Claire was scared. Anything can happen in this life. The patient is stable. He's conscious. We need your phone number so that we can call you when we move him to a regular ward. He will need constant care. He is a bedridden patient. What do I need to do? What should I prepare? Claire was worried all over again. Here's a list of things to take with you to the hospital. The doctor pointed to a poster. Excuse me, I have a lot of work to do. Goodbye. A bewildered Claire lowered her arms, then suddenly realized, Oh, thank you very much, doctor. Have a good day. The doctor was already closing the door behind her, but Claire had time to see a long row of catalogs on which lay men and women. As far as Claire could make out, covered only by sheets, next to them, like cranes on long legs, were racks of IVs. "Where are you, Christopher?" She tried to look out for Claire, but the door slammed shut in a second, a click sounding. Claire was already on the phone, the worried husband. "Claire, where are you? What have you got? Did you make it?" The stream of questions seemed never-ending. Finally, Jordan stopped talking and Claire was able to answer. "Yes, Jordan, I'm at the hospital. Christopher's in intensive care. They won't let me see him. He's in stable condition. I talked to the doctor, but Dad's conscious. What about him? Are you sure it's a stroke? Is there any hope he'll recover?" I was worried on the other end of the line. "Yes, as soon as the injections work and he feels better, he'll be moved to a room. I'll be right there. Wait for me, Claire. Stay there. Just where is it?" She explained where it was and added, "Only you can't go through the grounds. I'll be waiting for you at the entrance to the hospital courtyard on the square side." In 10 minutes she was already sitting in a warm, cozy car and once again detailed everything again. And as soon as he is transferred to a regular ward, someone must be with him all the time because there is not enough staff to take care of every stroke patient. We don't know what condition he's in yet. For the time being, in any case, there will be bed rest, feeding, washing. The nannies can't manage it all. "Claire, you realize I can't quit my job, right? I just signed a contract with the Chinese partners. I just need to be on site." Jordan was upset. Claire already realized what was about to come out of her husband's mouth. "But this is the men's room." "Jordan, how will I be there?" "I don't know." Jordan was confused. "Why don't you call and find out? Do it in the morning, honey, and you'll do a better job. You've always been in touch with Daddy. You know roughly what he needs and how to treat him, don't you?" When a sudden disaster strikes, people start looking for a way out. There is always someone they know who has already experienced the same or similar in their lives. So it happened with Claire. Coming to work in the morning, she saw the sympathetic looks of her colleagues, began to ask questions. "Oh, Claire, how are you doing? How's your father-in-law? Alive, I hope. How are you? How's Christopher?" The questions came one after another. All 5 women, sitting in the same office, had become friends and were aware of each other's family affairs. It turned out that the oldest of them, Doris, had once cared for a paralyzed aunt, and Lara, who had just joined the team, also had experience with her grandmother, who had suffered a stroke, but relatively mild. The first thing to do is to ask the doctor about painkillers, Doris stated. At first their pain is severe. It prevents them from starting exercises and workouts. Massage should be done lightly to relax the paralyzed side. "Oh, girls," Claire begged. "Thank you, but can I ask you to explain it all over again?" "Yes, of course," Doris and Lyra said almost in unison. "I haven't seen him. I don't know anything about his condition. By the time I get there, I'll have forgotten everything you told me." "Well, we're always in touch, Claire," Lyra reassured her. "They'll tell you everything. Every sick person is looked after by someone, a wife or a daughter." "Yes," Claire was surprised. "I was afraid it was a men's ward." "Yes, it is now." Doris even laughed. "Men don't go in such places, my dear. You have to save your strength, and it's a woman's job to clean up the dirt and carry the pots out. What's it to them, heroes? They won't trifle. They'll run away in half an hour." Claire was a little hurt by the woman's words, but they were true. At least Jordan could also take at least a week's vacation, so what if they were Chinese? Surely they are not more important than his own father. There was some truth in Doris's words. There was no escaping it. She called the hospital in the afternoon, and they reassured her that it was still a short time, but that the patient's condition was normal after such a blow. If everything goes according to plan, then tomorrow perhaps will be transferred to a regular ward. Having calmed down a little, Claire finished the day's work, but just in case she arranged for a vacation. The boss was understanding, but only asked her to warn the girls in the department. Claire, you always help your colleagues. Make sure that this time they are always ready to cover for you and keep the department on top of things. I will, Claire replied confidently. Our girls are great, they understand. She spent the whole day explaining things to Lara. It was supposed that she would substitute for those who had gone on vacation for the first time, which would be convenient for everyone, and at the same time she would get into the flow faster and learn different types of operations. At the same time, Claire, for some reason, could not get Doris' words about men out of her head. Walking home from work, through the quiet evening streets, she decided to put an end to this moving tangle of unpleasant feelings. At dinner at home, she looked straight into Jordan's eyes and asked, Jordan, you love your father, don't you? Why don't you at least try, yourself, to take a few days to be near him? He'd be glad. I'd love to. Jordan answered hotly, but as I explained to you, this is the time when things are going to get busy. If we miss the moment, someone without me will screw up, and then goodbye, foreign partners. Claire seemed to calm down. But I'm actually sure that Dad will be quite comfortable with you, and that's important in his condition. Jordan continued as if, unlike Claire, he knew his father's condition much more than she did. Honey, you see we could hire a nurse, but she'd be a complete stranger, and I want Dad to be with just us. Claire was again struck by the inappropriateness of that pronoun after the sentences her husband had just uttered. Well, obviously, I can't be around him all the time. I have a job, but I'll stop by as often as I can to buy whatever he and you need. Please, Claire, will you do it? What's your job worth to you? It's a nerve-wracking job, and here you're busy and at home and everything. But I can't be torn between two houses. And who's going to feed you, clean the house, cook your things? Claire, really, I'm not without a hand, and I'm 2 years old. The woman, a little hesitated, agreed, and from the next day began her new duties. Christopher was indeed transferred to the ward the day after tomorrow. Having arrived with a large bag of what she considered necessary, Claire saw that her father-in-law was already lying on a high special bed. His eyes were closed, the skin on his face and hands glowing with dead poverty. A fat, small nurse showed Claire the duck, toilet, and bath, explained the daily routine in a businesslike manner, and fled. The 3 women who were here, some with their husbands, some with their brothers or sons, looked at Claire with curiosity and sympathy. The neighbors helped her identify things, getting to know each other little by little. Meanwhile, Christopher opened his eyes and wheezed something. He was begging for a drink. The neighbor realized. She immediately took the drinker and showed Claire how to handle it. Lifting the old man's head, she tried as carefully as possible to give him a drink, but the water poured past him. The father-in-law groaned unhappily. Jordan? He whispered, almost wheezed. He's at work, Christopher. He'll come. He couldn't yet. He's got foreigners there. Claire reassured the old man. Don't worry, I'm with you. I'm not going anywhere. Slowly, they both adjusted to life in the hospital. It wasn't easy. Christopher, who had always been characterized by intelligence and patience, suddenly became tearful, could get cranky. "No, I won't have porridge. I can't swallow it," and he would sharply push the plate away with his healthy hand. Fortunately, he was affected by the side of the brain that does not affect speech. Intelligence didn't seem to be affected either. Only by comparing her previous interactions with the man did she realize the damage the disease had done to a man she respected. She already knew there would be outbursts of anger, groans of muscle pain, and even delirium at night. The old man, in his position, no longer had to think about shyness, since her father-in-law could not support himself, and little by little he developed the kind of trusting relationship with Claire that only a child has with its mother or nanny. All of this Claire endured. 3 weeks of treatment in the nightmarish conditions of a city hospital, with poor provision, finally came to an end. Claire said goodbye to her kind neighbors. By then a new shift of patients and caregivers had partially entered the ward. Christopher, so cordial and polite before, barely looked at his neighbors in the ward. He was all wrapped up in the cocoon of his own illness. Claire was a good thing. The ward is calm, even if a little depressed, and there is a complete change in his and Christopher's life. "Jordan, I ordered a pass to the territory. You drive up, right to the entrance." In the tone of an expert dispatcher, the command was to her husband on the morning of their discharge. Jordan came to pick them up in a large, comfortable car. In his arms, he carried his father from the hospital gurney into the salon. At home in the apartment had to go up only to the 2nd floor. Now Claire was with her sick father-in-law. Just gradually Claire's life returned to normal. True, now she could not find a job in her specialty, but Jordan consoled her again. "Get some rest. You need it now. Look at the weight you've lost, Claire. Get strong. Do whatever you want. I'll make sure you don't deny yourself anything. Let's see what it's like to be a housewife." Claire smiled sadly. In her new position, she found a silver lining. She read a lot, watched movies, decorated her and Jordan's cozy apartment. It turned out that things at home never end. The more you do, the more new things arise. Even at her father-in-law's, constantly obeying the wishes of the sick, she was not so busy. Now, however, it was a very welcome, spiritualized business, the troubles and joy. Having completed a small renovation of her somewhat neglected, over the years apartment, Claire was going to take care of her own health. The young woman decided to undergo an examination in the clinic and prepare for long-postponed motherhood. She had long dreamed of having children, and now her husband would have no excuses. Claire discovered that right next to their home, a new clinic opened, quite impressive looking. The flow of patients to this clinic did not expire, which inspired her faith in the reliability and professionalism of the doctors working there. She quickly found the clinic's website on the internet and called the number and made an appointment with the doctor. The doctor, by all accounts, was a good one. The walls of her offices in the paid clinic were full of all kinds of diplomas. Having carefully examined Claire, the doctor said to her, "I rarely see healthy women, to tell you the truth. I don't see any health problems with you, so you can get dressed." Continuing to take notes, she pronounced, "Still, don't delay getting pregnant. After all, 32 years old, even by today's standards." "Actually, that's what we were planning," lied Claire, expressing her dream. "The longer you think about planning, the harder it will be for you to carry a baby. The clock is ticking," smiled the gynecologist. She thanked for the recommendations and left the doctor's office. At last she felt light and calm. After a rainy, cold summer, the weather was great, which is rare in August. It was even hot, and the coolness of the evening was so welcome. The maples glistened with green paws of leaves. The birch trees spread their long strands along the whole alley. It was a shame that such a lovely day would be wasted if it wasn't used for a walk, to breathe in as much fresh air as possible, filled with the fragrance of greenery and flowers. God, it's beautiful! Claire gasped. No way I will not sit in four walls. The young woman decided to go to Krister's apartment, which had been empty for about a year. It should have been cleaned up long ago. At least some of the unnecessary junk should have been thrown out. Some of the things left behind should have been taken away. From the stop, Claire went not straight ahead, but down the long path. Still unable to escape the gloom, the old apartment from the bright sunshine and clean air. The keys to her father-in-law's apartment she carried with her, a long-standing habit. Opening the door, she took a step inside, but barely entered the hallway. She realized that the dwelling was quite habitable. At that very moment, much to her surprise, a 2-year-old boy came out of the room and stared at her with his little eyes. Just then, apparently his mother came out of the kitchen. She was an attractive woman who was clearly no more than 25 to 24 years old. "Who are you?" Claire asked in astonishment. "And what are you doing here?" "I'm Adriana. This is my son, Noah. We live here." The young woman didn't seem confused at all, but she wasn't surprised at Claire's arrival. "What right do you have to be here?" Claire was even more surprised. "This is my husband's apartment, Jordan, and who are you?" The stranger felt quite in her own right, standing firmly on her feet, and she wasn't going to answer to anyone, even if it was someone who opened the door with her own keys. Apparently, "I'm your husband's wife." She hummed stupidly and walked across the apartment without asking permission. Adriana, taking the baby in her arms, followed her everywhere. Claire found many changes in the familiar surroundings of the apartment. Christopher's bed was gone, replaced by a new, wide 4-poster bed. When Claire saw it, she wrinkled her nose. A sexodrome, and what kind of vulgar canopy over it? She was so disgusted to see the apparently shared bed of her husband and his mistress. And now what? Take up the knife, strike, as they say. The wardrobe in the bedroom was new, though inexpensive. Claire knew good things, but this was clearly an attempt to save money. Or had Adriana brought it from her possessions? It didn't matter at all. For some reason, however, Claire clung to every object, to the slightest change in the interior. She noted the beautiful mirror set in a beautiful frame and the expensive cosmetics in front of it on the dressing table. The apartment was quite clean, but there was no sense of style and coziness created by women's hands. It was a little bit of everything. There were heavy purchases, Jordan, as if the furniture was brought directly from the house of Sobakovich Nice. Good value, insignificant trifles obviously belonged to Adriana, and also there was a lot of what was left from the previous owner, Krister Hera. Grounded and ageless. A bookcase with numerous books and albums. A fundamental desk in the hall, or a real wooden closet for clothes in the bedroom. Strangely, this diversity of everything, the diversity of the surroundings, made it easier for Claire to accept her husband's apparent, accomplished, and long-standing adultery. Everything around was so unstable, unfounded, that she simply let the fact pass through her, not taking it to heart, or it was the first fever, the body's defensive reaction to stress. Both women were silent. She walked around the apartment, sat on the couch in the living room. "Is that Jordan's son?" she finally asked, looking at the baby's cute face. "Yes," Adriana answered calmly and evenly. "How long have you been here?" Claire asked. "Since Jordan, we have been here for 5 years," Adriana answered. 5 years? Claire bit her lip. So by the time her husband cheated on her, she had already served 5 years as a sister of mercy under her father, and for the next 5 years, her husband had enjoyed spending time with this girl, was apparently happy with her. She felt either a chill or the sensation of being splashed with ice water. He always told me to wait a while, that his wife was an invalid, and that's why he couldn't leave her. His wife needed constant care, and who would he be if he left her so helpless, couldn't part with her, pity her? Oh, pity? Claire didn't notice herself grinning ironically. Where did you meet then? At my house. Adriana answered simply. He kept promising me, saying he'd be free soon, and then we'd be together forever. How long have you lived here? For some reason, Claire asked. It's almost a year since he finally moved me and my son into his apartment, answered the interlocutor still as calmly. So I'm dead, and now there's nothing stopping you from being together. Claire sneered, unable to resist. It would appear so. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it wasn't what Jordan said. I love him and I believed what he said. Without any embarrassment, Adriana said. For some reason she had decided that she could tell her husband's wife everything in detail, and that it was even necessary to do so. Serenely patting her son on the back, she looked peacefully at Claire with her small eyes, framed by absolutely cow's lashes, tastelessly augmented, in a medium-sized salon. And she kept talking as if to a friend, retelling the story of her acquaintance with Jordan. I, myself, am a newcomer. I didn't pass the competition at the Institute, so I studied to be a hairdresser. My mother said don't go back to the district, stay here. Her sister has been living here for a long time, my aunt. She's lonely, so she got attached to me. I clean her floors, help her bathe, give her groceries, she feels good. So my aunt tells me, you, Adriana, you better finish hairdressing courses and earn money like people. Who need your institutes? That's right, I thought I'd go and learn. I grasped it on the fly, and now I'm working in a salon, men's hairdresser. Then again, Aunt Cindy made me do it. You don't know anything, Adriana. You need to get married. And where does a decent man always go? At the barber shop. Adriana looked at Claire apprehensively and bit her tongue. But Claire didn't care about her. Slowly, a bitter, soul-cutting truth began to creep in. She sits in a love nest and listens to the story of her husband's mistress. Could she have ever imagined such a thing? Yes, she couldn't have dreamed it. Simplicity is worse than stealing. Claire exhaled, looking at herself, and suddenly realized why she felt so bad. Until then, she had been sitting there without breathing, tense and tense. What? Perplexed asked Adriana, and without waiting for an answer continued. Well, in general, since the hall is male, there are many men every day, but Jordan, he is not like all of them. She looked at Claire again and finally blushed. Claire saw her neck blush, then pink patterns appeared on her chest. Her whole face turned ugly red too. Claire tried not to look at her. She hated to listen. The revelations to her young rival. Would you please call him from your number? She asked, holding back as best she could. Adriana obediently dialed the number, and after a few seconds, Jordan's familiar voice sounded in the receiver. Yes, Adriana, is something wrong? Claire took the phone from her hands and spoke. You're such a jerk, Claire. Jordan's voice sounded confused. What are you doing in there? How could you? How could you? Claire, come home. I'll explain everything to you. Jordan, of course, could not say anything else at the moment. He was simply dumbfounded. What can you explain to me? That while I was taking care of your sick father, you started a new family, lived a life of pleasure? You're a lowlife, a scumbag, a a scum. Do you understand? And I don't want to see you ever." She shoved the phone into the hand of a stunned Adriana and walked out of the apartment, slamming the door. She walked away, tears streaming down her eyes. "Traitor, scoundrel, traitor." Claire mentally scolded her husband. "He has the child, and me. What about me?" Claire had always dreamed of having children from the very first days of her marriage, but she had never been able to get pregnant. Many times she would go to the doctor, but each time Jordan would talk her out of it. And then, while caring for a sick old man, thoughts of having a child of her own left Claire. There was no time for that. Still, in her heart, she hoped that she was not the one to blame for the couple's inability to give birth. Going to the doctor had made her so happy. She believed that all was not lost. But now she has and will have nothing, no family, no children, no job. No one needs her, no one at all, not even herself. If she knew why Jordan's passport had turned so brightly pink, something she hadn't and couldn't tell anyone about, perhaps Adriana's story would have dispelled her a little. Claire, by virtue of her good heart, would even feel a little sorry for this distant girl who had seen nothing good in life. Not distant, but Adriana had become wise beyond her years, and with good reason. Adriana never saw her father and never knew him. Her mother only waved away her daughter's inquiries like an annoying fly and drunkenly said, "Fuck him. Remember him." Adriana's mother was drinking. Not only that, it was absolutely indiscriminate on acquaintance, Galena. She had 3 children by different fathers, and laughing, she told one of her sons, "God knows, Ethan, from whom I gave birth to you, I lived with John, and James was next door, so we came by and mended the porch." And she laughed unabashedly. The daughter was still alone, and her mother seemed to love her more than her sons, called her Adriana, her daughter, and even occasionally bought her a new dress. Of course, when there was money from a drunken suitor, and that didn't happen very often. The Boyds would not be lost, her mother thought. The army and prison would not let them starve to death. The country needed men. On the outskirts of their village, almost in the middle of nowhere, stood only the high fences of the camp, and many kilometers farther away stood the same settlers' settlements where the released prisoners had settled down. Moors in the settlement were most cruel. The licentiousness of the former prisoners bordered on anarchy, and the hard work in the wilderness, where there is nothing to do but lumbering, left no strength for other pleasures than drinking and debauchery. As usual, 15-year-old Adriana was quickly used by one of her mother's friends, taking advantage of her simplicity and the absence of her mother. Then showed her a knife, not scaring her much. This Adriana was enough to keep quiet. And so they lived until the girl, with sinfulness, graduated from school. The mother's lover went to the girl as soon as the mother got drunk or went somewhere, even for a short time. Then Adriana was already surprised by the miracle. For 3 years she never got pregnant. Her mother's roommate was a relatively young and seemingly handsome man. Perhaps it was still trying on the girl with the position of his secret mistress. Sometimes in a good mood, he praised Adriana for dignity, incomparable with the appearance of the mother, who with every drink became a terrible, sprawled-across old woman. Knowing that her mother had a sister in a distant city, Adriana convinced her mother by crying and constant persuasion that she should go there. Her mother wrote a tearful letter to her sister, and her aunt agreed to take her niece in for the first time. The rest of Adriana's story, Claire, was almost true, except for the legend of the institute. What institute? For the uneducated daughter of an alcoholic? The school in the village gave knowledge that was only enough to live in the village. It is true that exiled intellectuals from the capital's universities used to work at this school and even trained a few medalists, but that was so long ago. And those who received these medals left the terrible land as quickly as their teachers, who had finished their term of exile. In short, Adriana had settled into the city quite well. Not bad at all, if you remember where she came from and who she was. Now she was in a pretty prestigious place, and she was going out of her way to please both the customers and the boss. "Come in, please." She stretched her lips in a welcoming way in front of Jordan, who came in for a haircut. "How shall we cut his hair?" "Well, it's up to you." Jordan smiled back. He was happy to see a new face. "You've studied, but I haven't. And you've probably studied more than I have." Adriana frowned modestly. "Engineer or professor?" Jordan laughed at the girl's unsophisticated compliment and asked, "And you are new. Where Claire?" Claire was the name of his regular hairdresser, of a very respectable weight and no less respectable age. "Yes, I've been hired to replace her on a trial basis, and they said I'd see what happens." Claire's retired. "Enough," she says. "Her legs have sprouted pillars by the chair. I'll dig in the vegetable garden and move to a country house. Except for onion shoots, I will not cut anything in my life. That's enough." Adriana laughed merrily. Jordan gave in to her fun and joined in. From the very first meeting, an extraordinary ease settled between them. Not for nothing, apparently, there is an opinion that love is chemistry. This gravitation of two, the desire to connect, and appeared in an instant, as soon as he saw Jordan Adriana. Without thinking, he wanted to see her again, to be closer to her. Then he realized that Adriana reminded him of the young Claire, the same mischievous eyes and dark curls. But that realization came much later, when he realized what a trap he had fallen into the moment he had decided to meet the young hairdresser after work. Adriana is so innocent and youthful, fresh as Jordan thought. Looking at her dark blonde curls and slender figure, she appeared to be very skillful in lovemaking. How was Jordan to know what and how the released prisoner had taught her 3 whole years in the settlement? Having arrived in the city, Adriana did not lead a monastic life either. Before entering the prestigious salon where she met Jordan, she had traveled the thorny path of an apprentice and was building up her hand, which it must be admitted she excelled at. She started out cutting and shaving men in a station barber shop, and what kind of people did not fall to her? One of the occasional customers, a smashing little guy who also came from the province and settled in the city in the auto shop, captivated her heart and became a constant lover. Chuckling, he told her, "You catch the customer by the beard, do you hear? We'll catch a daddy with you, you and the pleasure of it will get. All I will be easier, and even more money from him to make money. And we with you in the summer on his money, and to the sea. You say too." Adriana sulked. "I love you alone. Do I need some daddy? Love me. Who won't let you, you fool?" Lover laughed happily. "And don't let your daddy out of your hands if you get him." And he strong hand rolls the girl on a joint bed. Recently, the couple began to rent a common room. It's economical and convenient. So about a date with Jordan, allegedly on her living space, Adriana lied without blinking an eye. In fact, having become close in an instant, she and Jordan made love, right in Claire's apartment. Moreover, in her own bed, knowing that Claire, she would hardly have been able to have such a quiet conversation with Adriana for such a long time. But a decent person usually sees in another a person like herself, and it could not even occur to Claire how far human baseness could extend. After all, she came to her house only briefly while Christopher slept. Sometimes he was under the care of a nurse who, for a small fee, would visit the sick man to give him an IV of medication for support. The treatment lasted about an hour, and longer with a massage. Claire was on the run making dinner. Jordan cleaned up abandoned things, and not once did the thought of what was going on here without her at night creep up on her. Yes, her husband called her often, at each call asking what she and her father should bring. And also when, at what hour she would be, in their shared apartment, it didn't bother her at all. She didn't even pay attention to her husband's unusual meticulousness. On the contrary, it was pleasant his attention, waiting, counting the hours, let's go to my place. I want to treat you to a great coffee. Hiding his eyes, proposed Jordan, Adriana, for the first time, about a week after we met. It was already late evening, and they left the cozy cafe where they had spent several evenings. Kissing and cuddling in the car interior, a grown man and a blossoming woman, did not satisfy. Both wanted to continue. And your wife? Adriana was a little surprised. The rest didn't bother her. That was the way she was. Wife, didn't I tell you? Jordan was a little confused, although he had warned Adriana about being married right away. He would be honest with this nice girl. Adriana immediately made it clear that it was impossible to meet at her place, because she lived at her aunt's place, although perfectly continued to share a room together with her former lover. She intuitively felt what and when to say, when to smile, and when to open up to meet a man. Having acquired an urban appearance, the girl also learned the ability to behave discreetly. She could not be taught to deceive. She did it brilliantly. But to keep silent where necessary, to create an image of a well-bred, well-mannered maiden, this skill had to be learned as best as possible and preferably faster. Adriana was learning. She watched the men. They showed their feelings even more vividly than women. They turned out to be excellent teachers. Say the wrong thing, and the handsome guy would snap like the last skier. A chiseled guy could get a square swear if he got the wrong haircut. Compliment, affectionate smile, worked wonders. Knave men bought them like children. Barbershop became for Adriana a kind of institute of noble maidens. She could portray any gait, any smile, from a simple and naughty girl to a price-conscious beauty, expanded her art of reincarnation. Of course, these charms applied only to men, and any woman could immediately recognize Adriana in 5 minutes. But men were coming, and for 5-minute seduction, fuse, and talent, Adriana had enough. Fascinated by Adriana's youth and the novelty of his own position, free, in love, Jordan, as if plowing in weightlessness, but had to decide what to do next. And so he decided. My wife is an invalid, he said, and after a satisfied look at the girl's surprised face, he continued, I periodically put her in the hospital to heal, but pity her, she is also a person. I could not praise myself. What a good boy. Now he wouldn't have to explain to Adriana why there were women's things in his apartment. At the same time, he made a deposit for future meetings with her. The base is a word. Adriana, not suspecting that decent-looking men, too, can lie, easily accepted his proposal and surprised Jordan, liberation and temperament, their first night together. The next day, the ardent lover could think of nothing else but another night, and Adriana again behaved with complete freedom, and he was easy and simple with her. And Claire, what of Claire? She hadn't bothered him in a long time. Talking only about diapers and medications and a new bedsores mattress, anyone's feelings would fade, and he's a living man. He's a man, after all, a successful one, by the way. There was not a single decent acquaintance of his who did not have a permanent mistress, and now it was his turn too. He could afford an expensive beauty, but he liked this cute hairdresser, although it would be better without this job in the service industry, of course. Somehow it is not prestigious. After a couple months of lovemaking, he decided that he didn't have to show Adriana to anyone, but if anything, he wouldn't be ashamed to pass with her. Acquaintances will only smack, looking at the lush forms of his girlfriend. But to confess that your mistress works in a beauty salon, haircuts, and shaves other men, it is somehow not comical. Adriana, you should quit that job, he said, resting after the raucous entertainment. Adriana lifted her dark head from his shoulder and looked into his eyes. When are we to be married? Jordan, strangely enough, was not ready for marriage with a live wife, so he took the conversation aside. Adriana, soon I'll rent you an apartment, so we'll be there, we'll see each other more easily and freely. And my wife, she's not a bad person, she suffers. Poor thing. I try to create all conditions for her, of course, but the disease, it progresses. I'd be an asshole if I left her now. You'd be the first to judge me, darling. And he rushed to kiss Adriana, showering her with compliments, and Adriana laughed again, forgetting her purpose. Adriana could wait a long time, but here she was not forced to do anything. After seeing Jordan off, she pulled the curtain on the window, a sign to her roommate that the entrance to her apartment was available. He had moved out immediately from the old small apartment to this one, rented for Adriana by Jordan, and the presence of men's things. Adriana easily explained to Jordan that her brother, a student, often visited her on weekends. She couldn't deny him a vacation and a full meal at her sister's house, could she? Jordan's free weekends suited him just fine, and he easily took on his brother's version of the story. His father and Claire were eagerly awaiting him on Saturday and Sunday too. While Jordan was with his father, Claire would get at least a few hours of freedom to clean up, socialize with her friends, at least go to the sauna after all. It turned out that everything worked out marvelously well for everyone. Everything settled down. Adriana finally quit her job. Jordan gave her enough money to support her young lover, but he still decided to keep his job. 2 years into her relationship with Jordan, Adriana suddenly found herself pregnant. She thought that her body was now rested after the stress. She didn't have to live in constant tension, so she was able to conceive. Wow, a kinder was made. Her roommate laughed, neither surprised nor pleased. But you, Adriana, don't count on me. I'm a shitty father. I have such a kinder, probably, all over the country is full of running. So come on, make your daddy happy. He needs an hair. I was just on my way to a construction site. A friend of mine wants me to go. The man, very far from thinking about the family nest, quickly packed his things and drove off in an unknown direction. Most likely not that far away, just to avoid Adriana's eyes. The confused Adriana cried for a long time, abandoned by her constant lover, with whom she had long since gotten over. Jordan arrived, saw her swollen face, and rushed to embrace her. Adriana, what are you doing? Who's hurt you? No one. Adriana sobbed. I'm pregnant. Oh, what a trouble you're in. Jordan laughed. It's wonderful. You'll give birth to a beauty like you. Until now, Jordan had never suspected that the news that he would soon become a father would make him happy. For so many years, he had avoided persistent conversations with Claire about the future birth of a child. Why he had avoided parenthood, Jordan himself could not answer. Not ready, that would be the truth. And here he himself did not understand why, out of a desire to appease his mistress, the acceptance of this unknown infant was suddenly born. With every visit to Adriana, this acceptance grew stronger, and now he himself did not understand why he so desperately refused future fatherhood. living with Claire. Incidentally, it must be said that he continued to have a wonderful relationship with Claire. He showed touching care for his wife, but there had been no intimacy between them for a long time. Claire, a proud and self-sufficient woman, did not touch the subject out of delicacy. There was no need for tenderness. Christopher was dying. He was already 40 days old. Claire had long lived at home, and the couple continued to live as brother and sister. Returning from the gynecologist, Claire was just about to gather the mental strength to decide to have the most important conversation with her husband for the future of their family. It began to rain, but she, as if without noticing it, took among some half-abandoned cottages, not thinking at all about where she was going. The phone in her bag rang insistently, but she paid no attention to it. Only feeling deadly tired, the woman looked around, saw an old bench under a tree, sat down, leaned her head against the rough table, and closed her eyes. At that time, a white-haired little boy was running along the sidewalk, slapping on the puddles, enjoying the splashes that flew from under his bare feet. He tried to run exactly in the middle of the small puddles that had managed to form from the rain, and now they glistened under the light of the lantern. He squealed and laughed joyfully when the splashing water hit his face and carelessly licked the muddy drops off his lips. It was Adam, a 3-year-old little boy who had run away from his loving grandmother, and his great joy from an independent walk. There was no limit. "Adam, I'm in trouble with you," shouted the old lady, trying to catch up with her grandson and not keeping up with him. "Where are you going on the puddles? Stop. I say, you'll catch cold, and you'll have to take care of yourself. Oh, you are my bitter little sorrow." Finally, she managed to pick up the baby, but she immediately let him go, shrieking from the pain that shot through her lower back. She turned to look around for a bench, and only then saw a woman sitting on a bench under a tree. The old woman shuddered fearfully. "Lord, your power! What is it?" The little boy in his grandmother's arms also quieted down when he saw the stranger, and with some fear looked at the pale face of the sitting woman. "Is she alive?" The old woman muttered, slowly approaching the bench. Then she stepped toward Claire and touched her with her hand. "Whose are you going to be, girl? Why are you sitting out here in the rain? What's the matter with you?" Claire opened her eyes. "Don't worry, I'll be right out. I just got lost here by accident. Where would you go in this darkness?" The old woman looked around worriedly. "Well, let's go to my place. It's my house over there." Lifting Claire by the elbow, she continued to speak softly. "I live with my grandson. Is my name Margaret? And this is Adam." The frightened boy looked out from behind Margaret's back. Claire followed the friendly old woman. She had no strength, and she would certainly not have made it home on her own. The place was remote. The phone was dead. There were no cars or cabs around. It was a completely unfamiliar suburb where she had never been in her life. Soon enough they came to an old 2-story house, probably from the time of the first builders. They went up to the 2nd floor and entered a small apartment. Margaret put the kettle on and took her grandson into the bathroom. "I'll only be 5 minutes, darling," she said to Claire. "Otherwise, God forbid he gets sick, I'll warm the child." She quickly bathed Adam in a hot bath and brought him to the kitchen. "Now for some hot tea." After Adam, she also went to the bath and cleaned herself up. The hot shower made her feel better, and she was able to answer Margaret's questions. "I, Margaret, learned a terrible thing today," she began quietly. "I have no husband, no child, no family." "Oh, no," the new acquaintance groaned. "Are they dead?" "No, my husband is alive, even happy. He abandoned me, Margaret, and abandoned me a long time ago, and I was a fool. I lived quietly, and trusted the scoundrel. Wanting to talk, the woman told about herself, not hiding any details from the old woman. Why did he do that? I did everything for him, loved, cared, and what happened? I took care of his father for 10 years, and during that time he betrayed me, cheated on me. How can you do that? And the most frustrating thing is that I'm 32 years old and I don't have children. I do not even imagine whether I can even think about men. I dream about a child. 10 years I lived next to my dying father-in-law, and I thought only about a baby. While I look for a new husband, my time will be up. Claire grinned bitterly and sipped the cooled tea. Renewing the brew, the women began the tea party anew. The hostess remembered the forgotten cutlets and warmed them for her new friend. You probably haven't eaten anything since this morning. Here, eat this, you'll feel better. Everything seems bad to a hungry person, but on a full stomach it's no trouble at all. Claire only now remembered that in the morning before going to the doctor, she had not eaten anything, thinking that she would have to take tests. Poppy seed in her mouth since last night. She feels completely drained. At first through force, living through a juicy morsel, she gradually got into the flavor. The meat was fragrant with garlic and onions, and with hot tea, Claire ate 3 cutlets and turned a little pink. Margaret began to comfort Claire, and Adam and I, too, were left alone. There are not only men who are unfaithful, there are also enough butterflies among women that fly from flower to flower. They're all looking for the best and the sweetest. Did Adam's mom leave him? Claire guessed. She's beautiful. Why would she bother with a child? She'd rather spread her beauty around the world, live for herself. And that's how deceptive appearances can be, Claire. Was she really beautiful? She took an interest in this family. The son came. Mom, I'm getting married. Here's the bride. Well, I look at her. She looks like a daughter-in-law, a nice girl, lovely to look at. She's tall, straight, looks into the eyes, looks cheerful, and has curls. Now this miracle is made with her own hands, so she knows how to do something, also good. I guess you can't drink water off a face, of course, but my Harry is worth every beauty. It's not good for a mother to praise her child, but my son, he looks like a hero from a picture. He took after my father, and our father was a man to all men. It's all right that he's found a match. God willing, they'll get along happily. Get married. I say the young years are passing. Why grow old alone? Let's have a family. Together you'll look for what you want and build it. I blessed my son. We summoned the guests, celebrated honorably, everything as it should be. Right after the wedding, my daughter-in-law got pregnant and gave birth to Adam. And now, not like before, the little one needs diapers and food, not like nowadays. He doesn't suck a tit, and his food is very expensive, they say, so he started to run out of money. Margaret told how the money shortage started, how she tried to save money and diversify at least the food of the young. She got Piglet, worked from morning till evening on a small vegetable garden, made rolls so that the harvest would not go to waste. But of course it was not enough, and the young wife sat at home more, not helping with the household in any way. She always had an excuse. She had a stomachache. Adam did not let her sleep at night. Adam was capricious. Margaret put up with it too, as long as the child was looked after. But Harry would not spoil her mood because her son tries, works, takes overtime when he can. So we stretched as hard as we could, but we got tired. That's what I'm telling you, Claire. Harry came home from work one day and said he was leaving the workshops. Turns out a friend of his from the army had written him a letter. He didn't write often, but this was just in time. He's been on a business trip for a long time, and he calls Harry to him. He writes to us that we need such people very much. You're not a drinker, handy and ahead, all sorts of tasks, like nuts. He wants Harry to work with him because his partner moved to the south and gave up business trips. He needs to be treated in the sea air, so my Harry has decided he's going to work on a rotational basis. What about your sister-in-law? Did she agree? Claire asked. How could she not? She loved money, that she will buy on joy. Everything. She liked to dress up a lot, but my grandson was dressed up like at Tsarevich. I kept scolding them. Don't spoil the boy like that. He doesn't understand anything yet, and they put new expensive clothes on him every day. They wash them, so he doesn't have time to put them on a second time, as everything is already too small. He grows by leaps and bounds, but life has gotten better, hasn't it? Claire either asked or confirmed. Oh, Claire, on the outside, everything is peaceful. Money seems to have improved, but what's inside a man, you can't see at once. The wife turned out to be a troublemaker. She strayed when Adam was not even a year old. I didn't say a word when I noticed the affair. Harry came to visit. We had a goodbye, he went away, but she's so fussy about it. She's been trying all sorts of ways to get out of the house to deceive me. And she attacked the wrong one. I waited for her until she came back late, smelling of wine. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes wandering. Come on, sister-in-law, I told her, sit down next to me and let's talk. Where have you been? Who were you out with? Don't lie to me. I've seen your sister. I'm a woman myself. I know at a glance who breeds what. Well, Claire got excited. So she sat down, her eyes down to the floor, playing the innocent, but she kept silent, and I kept silent. We were sitting like that, and suddenly she started crying. Excuse me, she's crying, Mommy. She called me Mom. She lost her mother long ago. And you? Interest, Claire in the lives of complete strangers, was growing. What about me? My business is old, I told her so. It's not me I'm telling you to live with, sweetheart. You have a husband. And if you think about it, you have a son too. Will you sit like that in front of them? How will you look into their eyes? She cried, and they went to bed. And I didn't sleep all night. I had no peace. And in the morning I fell asleep, so soundly that I didn't hear anything. Only when Adam woke up and began to grunt, I jumped up to him. I looked, and my sister-in-law's bed was empty, and the bed was tidied up neatly as before the guests. I looked in the closet, and there was not a single dress. All I immediately realized, she ran away with her boyfriend, unknown to what distant lands, and she did not take any money. Unless she had a separate amount with her, but I know nothing about that, but I do not have time to sit and cry. So I dressed up my grandson and fed him, took him for a walk and sang songs. That's all. Did you even write or call afterwards? Her only listener was worried. No, Claire, I waited. I think she is a mother, such a wonderful boy, how not to love and miss him. But no, not once, not a single word. So she hasn't been around since. She has, of course she has. You can't go far without money, and that man doesn't need her without money. My sister-in-law came back 2 weeks later. Harry hadn't even gotten back from his business trip yet. Adam and I are walking from the store with a heavy grocery bag in one hand and my grandson in the other, and near the entrance, Mother of God. My daughter-in-law is sitting there. Adam shouted, Mom, Mom, but she and cry and hug my son. She almost falls on her knees in front of me again. There are a lot of unkind eyes around. Everyone is curious about what's going on in the neighborhood. But I picked up the bride and took her home. What to be ashamed in front of people? And she, poor thing, continues to wail about her misfortune. "What shall I do, Mother?" she says. "How can I go on? She won't forgive me, Harry, and neither will you." And Adam, he cuddled up to his mother, hugging her, saying his own things to her. And I felt sorry for the poor head. He grew up without a mother. Who would teach him life? A mother to a child, whatever she is. Don't make another orphan out of Adam. Let them raise their own child if they've given birth. How could she? Claire was indignant. To abandon such a lovely boy. And that's my sweetheart. She must have been a breed. She'd live like a human being, and then she'd do something nasty. So we agreed that we wouldn't say anything to Harry, and we'd start our lives all over again, as if she'd never done anything wrong. It's not uncommon for young people to have disagreements and quarrels between husband and wife. But as they embrace and sleep in the same bed for a night, all the past will be forgotten and there will be peace and tranquility in the house again. Didn't it work out that way for them? Claire asked. I don't know. Harry was making good money. I tried to help everyone. Kelly, that's my daughter-in-law, tried not to spend too much money, so they decided to separate. At least a little, but to have their own place. They moved from me to a one-room apartment, and to pay for it took, as it is called now, a big loan for housing exactly. A mortgage? That's what Claire said. That's the one. Margaret rejoiced, a forgotten word. They live on their own. And what about me? My eyes can't see, my ears can't hear what's going on between them. Whether we lovebirds live amicably, but only in peace, I have not known since then. I wondered if Kelly would bear it, if she'd keep her temper, or if she'd go back to her old ways. She didn't hold back, so she went out again. Claire said yes to Paula. She has. Maybe she inherited it from her parents, but she had a nature that couldn't be overcome. Was my son worth it, to change him for swindlers? He doesn't drink, he can't stand it. Well, he smokes. It's a hard job. He's used to it. He's never tried tobacco before. He's not a bad character. He doesn't pick on little things. He does everything for the house, everything with a smile. Kelly sleeps in the morning and won't go to the baby. I boil sometimes. It's not a good thing for a grown woman to lie in bed until noon, until the sun starts to blaze up her ass, but Harry just smiles. Let her sleep, Mama. She never slept so sweet as she did at your place. How did she do it in her apartment? Claire wondered. I suppose she did. I've only been there a couple of times, and then I've come with my own hotels. She said, "Oh, Mama, how delicious, what pies you bake." She praises them, but she puts store-bought sausage and cheese on the table. I found out later that she started treating Harry badly, too. She'd disappear for a night or two, and he wouldn't say a word, wouldn't bother me. That's when I wished I'd warned him. Watch your wife. She's not averse to running off to the left. And then Kelly, our dear Kelly, she started drinking. One day she went to the store and did not return, but now she left with money, all that was at home, earned by her husband, took with her. She will come back, come to her senses and come back. How can she leave her son? Margaret comforted Claire. No, honey, she's not coming back. She's dead. She had an accident. Claire, who had not expected such an outcome, covered her mouth with her hand in fright. Margaret continued her sad story. She was traveling with a man, and they died together, whether it was her half-lover or another unknown. I don't know the details. Harry told me all about it. She sold their apartment together, too, as it turned out. How could she do that? It's a complicated process. Everyone who lives in the apartment has to participate in it. Claire was once again surprised. And they also have a minor child, His share is not allowed to be sold in any case. The guardianship authorities monitor it because he is defenseless, Adam, and should not remain without registration and without housing. Claire was aware of a lot of the legal laws by nature of her job, so she sold it to some crooks. There's all these black whatchamacallits nowadays. Black realtors? That's what Claire said. Yeah, that's what her half-lover set her up with, and got Kelly to do the paperwork. They got a law against the law. They'll get around anything. They say they even kill people for housing if they get a lonely person who nobody asks if they're alive. And then what? Claire was already looking forward to the denouement. Then she ran away, collected all the coins and ran. The money's been squandered. So Harry came to me with Adam, asked me to look after him. He said I had a contract to finish my work. I let him go. I'm looking after my grandson myself, but it's getting harder and harder every day. While the women were talking in the kitchen, Adam fell asleep. Claire helped her carry the boy to his crib, and then she and Margaret cleared the table. She washed the dishes, and as she fell asleep, she was surprised to think that she hadn't thought of her husband at all for hours. In the morning after breakfast, she thanked the old woman for everything. Margaret, you saved me. I had no one to turn to talk to, and here you are. God brought me to you. Come on, my dear, the old woman said. If it wasn't for me, who else would have found someone else? A man in the world will not be lost. You just don't sit alone. Close yourself. Come out of your resentment. She kissed Adam on his fair head and hugged his grandmother and went home. Promised to come back soon. She really did want to get back to those two as soon as possible, to help as much as she could with them. She didn't want to go home, but there was nowhere to go. She had to solve an unexpected and despicable situation, which was created by the husband she loved before. The husband turned out not to be full of peers at all, as it would have been good if he had spared the woman from finding out about the relationship. Remembering that the best defense is offense, Jordan from the first minute took the form of insulted virtue. He met his wife with indignant words. "Where have you been, Claire?" Saying God knows what to me on the phone, throwing me off my rhythm. "You're sleeping at God knows whose house." Oh, Claire grinned, no longer surprised by Jordan's insolence. "You're out of rhythm, aren't you? And I thought you had already learned to sit on two chairs, to maneuver between two families? Well, I haven't succeeded yet." She saw that Jordan had lost a little of the high ground from which he had intended to speak to her. He shrank back and lowered his head. "Claire," he spoke in a different way, "you have to understand, there's a child in there." I didn't think anything of it. I wasn't going to have an affair on the side, but I couldn't take it. Claire looked at him straight on. "You couldn't stand the lonely idleness while I was courting your father, could you? You wanted a young body, a free relationship. Well, good for you. You're doing great. It's not like that. You're overplaying your hand. I resented you. I'm a man. I need to feel supported and cared for. And I'm a woman, so I don't need anything at all, do I?" Claire was beginning to boil. "You haven't spent a single night with my father. Not once have you offered to help me with the nurse. And I'm a young woman, too. Men still look at me, by the way, even though I've dried up and aged over the years." Jordan had nothing to say, and she was getting more and more atomized. "Do you realize what it means to spend years after a sick old man? How many times I got up to my father every night. How hard it was for me to lift him, to wash him. How I withered without society, without girlfriends. I have none left." Claire cried. They both could not remember how they had been as young people, loving each other and full of life plans. Jordan felt a grudging estrangement from his wife, forgetting everything she had sacrificed so that he could pursue his career in peace. Claire was thrown into shock by Jordan's betrayal. She simply couldn't imagine how he could have gotten to such a point of hypocrisy, though she could now recall many episodes she hadn't paid attention to. Some suspicious or inappropriate words of his, letting them pass her ears. "You're selfish." Blamed her own self after all, Jordan. "You've always been preoccupied only with yourself, with your own needs. Your long lists, your demands, the grocery lists I fed your father, demanding a nurse or a doctor to visit Christopher at home." Claire was no longer able to be indignant. She looked at her husband's flushed, aroused face and couldn't understand how her beloved Jordan could hide in the body, this fat, lustful male, thinking only of himself. What had to happen for a man to change so much? After all, Jordan's mother and father were deeply decent people. A lot of things made sense now. They had lived apart for a long time. Except for Christopher, they had nothing left to bind them together. You wouldn't think of a shared living space as a bond, but as the fruit of a marriage. Yes, and this apartment, for 10 years, became not cozy, abandoned, although they tried to bring it to a more decent form. With the salary that Jordan received, they could have long ago bought a more spacious home to equip it according to the latest fashion, hire a designer and excellent craftsman, but she had no strength, and he had no desire to somehow strengthen the household, and thus the family. And now she is alone at a broken trough. This does not scare her at all. The protective power of the body does not give Claire despair and think about the future. She needs to urgently cut this knot of feelings that has been tormenting her for more than 24 hours, because it is unbearable. Enough. Powerfully, she interrupted Jordan, who was already carrying something completely obscene, purposely atomizing himself. She only heard the words about her infertility, but she didn't care anymore. "Pack your things and leave. You have your own apartment now. You have a wife and a son. Go. I can't promise to die, but you'll finally be Adriana forever. I'll file for divorce tomorrow." "I will," answered the confused Jordan. He did not expect such a quick resolution of the case. Taking the big bag, he slammed the door. Claire only grinned again, noting, "Prepared, packed the bag in advance." 2 months passed, and Claire became a frequent visitor to Margaret and Adam. She did all the housework, looked after the boy and his grandmother, and became very attached to them. She didn't want to stay in her own apartment. First of all, she had gotten used to it over the years. Secondly, she felt stuffy there. Memories came into her head, plunging her again and again into a maelstrom of bad moods and depression. She would only leave for her place in the evening, but in the morning she would deal with the divorce proceedings, grab a bite to eat somewhere on the beach, and wander around the city until she was exhausted. The weather, for Claire, was now good for anything. She treasured every hour of freedom and the opportunity to enjoy nature and the cityscape. One evening, when Claire was about to go to bed, the phone rang. It was Margaret. The old woman's voice sounded muffled and painful. "Claire, I'm not feeling well. I've called an ambulance. Come to Adam, for God's sake. He'll be alone if they take me away." Claire called a cab and rushed to the boy, taking some of the groceries she had at home. Half an hour later, she was already there. She saw an ambulance at a familiar entrance. Worried, she ran up to the second floor. The doctor had just examined the patient and was washing his hands. "Doctor, what's wrong with her?" Claire asked. "You see, it needs a full examination." The doctor answered evasively. "Her condition is moderately serious. She needs rest. We will take her to the hospital, and the main treatment will be prescribed after the final diagnosis." From that day on, Claire's worries increased. Now she visited the old woman in the hospital, brought her home-cooked food, and comforted her, promising that everything would be all right. Adam never let go of Claire's hand, and Margaret thanked God that she had someone to leave her beloved grandson to. One evening, Claire was putting Adam to bed. She read him a book, laid him on his side, covered him with a blanket, and began to hum a little song. Suddenly he looked over her head and jumped out of bed screaming, "Daddy, Daddy." Claire turned and stood in the doorway with a surprised face. A tall, handsome man froze and looked at her without understanding anything. Then he picked up his son in his arms, kissed him, and asked, "Adam, who is this?" The boy took his father's face in his palms, looked into his eyes, and with complete seriousness whispered, "This is my mother, only it's a secret." The little boy didn't want to let go of his father. "Adam, but Daddy drove a long time, then flew on an airplane. He is very tired and hungry." Claire explained, "All right, feed him." Reluctantly, he let go of his father's hand. "Dad, will you come to sleep at my place?" "Of course, son," the father promised fervently. As always, that's why he was coming. Claire put the boy to bed again and closed the door and went into the kitchen. Quickly warming up the food, she set the table and sat down across from Harry. "I'll feed you for real in the morning, but for now there's nothing else to eat. I'm sure it's a nice dinner after a working canteen." Harry smiled and began to chow down on the soup. Over tea, Claire couldn't help herself. "I know a lot about you, Harry. Your mother told me." The man looked seriously into her eyes. "Well, that's good. I hope to get to know you better, too." 2 years had passed since Harry had discovered Claire in his house. They were married and quite happy. A few months ago, they had moved into the house Harry had bought, a large, spacious house with plenty of room for everyone. Margaret couldn't get enough of her daughter-in-law and kept telling her son that she had found him such a good wife. Adam had long ago called Claire Mama, and she was genuinely happy about it, gifting the boy with unspent maternal love. She was picking out an ice cream cone near the summer kiosk when a man's voice called out to her. Turning around, she saw Jordan. She recognized her ex-husband immediately, but was struck by the change in his appearance. Jordan had grown old and flabby. His stomach hung over the strap of his pants, and he looked untidy and unkempt. "Hello, Claire." Jordan came very close to her and wanted to reach out his hand or hug her, but when he ran into his ex-wife's gaze, he got embarrassed and lowered his hands. "Hello." Claire answered not so much coldly as indifferently. She was deeply indifferent to this strange man, and the meeting did not please her at all. "How are you?" Jordan asked, looking the woman over from head to toe. It was the same old Claire, young, slender, and beautiful. Only better then? Probably over the years, she had gained self-confidence, the kind of confidence that only loving and beloved women have. Jordan did not know how to analyze, but he felt this confidence at once, and with a cold heart, he reached out to his ex-wife. "Good, and you, I see, not too much?" Claire inquired, unable to hide her dislike. "Yes, I'm divorced." Jordan waved his hands in different directions, as if confessing his helplessness. Though Claire didn't ask him any questions, he began to tell her in a hurry. "Adriana, she lied to me. It turned out she didn't have a child with me. I spent 5 years raising someone else's boy. Do you understand, Claire?" He looked at Claire again, as if complaining of injustice and asking for protection. "Well, what can we do? It's not the child's fault," Claire said, and then she made up with her ex and went to him. Just left a note on the table. Some people don't leave notes. Claire grinned bitterly, remembering her past experiences. However, now everything was almost forgotten, and she didn't want to remember, not to have anything to do with her ex-husband, not even to stand next to him. It was unpleasant for her. She looked away impatiently, waiting for Jordan to make way for her. "Claire, I'm so sorry to you. You know, I miss you so much. Why don't we try to start over? You love me, and I love you. You're too late. Jordan, with your love, I don't need it now." Claire turned away to make herself comfortable, to grab the ice cream bag and walk away, but he grabbed her arm. "Claire, I'm alone, all alone. I won't make the same mistake I made last time, and you're alone too, so why don't we get together? You're childless. Who needs you but me?" "No, I'm not childless." Claire grinned contemptuously. "But that's none of your business." With her head held high, she strode past Jordan while he continued to stare after her. The man saw a tall, handsome man approach the woman. He held the hand of a blonde-haired boy, about 5 years old, and on his neck sat a little girl with dark curls on her head, diligently eating cotton candy. The happy family went on their way. Jordan stood and looked after them for a long time, thinking that he himself had given his happiness to this stranger.
Subscribe and click the bell.
A young man, a lawyer. In the dentist's chair, he's wiggling his face, waving his hands, making strange, muffled noises. Just a little more patience. The dentist calms him down. Just a little bit more. The doctor raises his head, looks for his assistant with his eyes, points to some device with his gaze and waits. Nancy gets angry. "Doctor, stop flying in the clouds." Guess what? The young woman looks at the doctor confused, then quickly grabs the appliance and hands it to the dentist. The patient continues to fidget in the chair. His eyes are full of confusion and pain. He is mooing, poking his fingers into his mouth. The doctor frowns. To remove the saliva, he clarifies. The patient nods his head in relief. He stretches his hand up and gives the doctor a thumbs up. The dentist drills his gaze back to the assistant. "Nancy, are you keeping an eye on the patient?" His voice changes to a shout. Yes, sorry." Nancy picks up the appliance and sets it in motion. "Aya, I'm sorry." The assistant continues to apologize. The dentist, disgruntled, shakes his head disappointedly. When the procedure is over and the patient's extension or mouth is taken out, he quickly rises from the chair. He moves behind his warm jaw, runs his hands over his face, spits it out into a special jar, and looks reproachfully at Nancy. "George." He turns to the doctor. "Where'd you pick your assistant like that?" "The Center for the Retarded." I almost choked on my own saliva. He's trying to get to his feet, but he's not doing so well. A lot of people are quiet after being horizontal for so long. "Change the assistant, or I won't be back for a second appointment." "This is outrageous. I will complain." George, the dentist, calmly listens to the young man's complaints. He puts on a benevolent smile, conciliatingly says, "I agree with you completely. I'm sorry. I'll change the assistant by the next appointment." The young man nods contentedly, breaking out in a cold sweat. "What do you mean, I'll change assistants?" The woman thinks in confusion. "I can't lose my job." Her hands shake. Her legs become absorbent cotton from heavy thinking. She's snapped out of it by a patient's voice. Look at her. She's probably drinking like a horse. He's visibly angry. He takes a step toward Nancy and points his finger angrily at her. "I wish you all the worst." The dentist approached the young man and took him gently, almost friendly, under the elbow. "Well, shall we go to payment?" "Aha, let's go." The boy nodded sternly and followed the doctor. George led the patient away from the office. Nancy began to clean up. Her mind was spinning not to fire, not to fire. She herself realized that she had been doing a bad job lately because of the problems that had accumulated like a snowball at home. The woman had almost stopped sleeping. She stopped at the sink, looked up, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her once thick and colorful hair, having lost its former beauty, was sloppily gathered into a tiny bundle. The gray strands were mixed with some gray faded hair color. The hair used to be a different color. Had it been? Deep wrinkles, like ditches. If the wrinkles were filled with water, they would turn into rivers of circles under her eyes' dull, earthy, clear complexion. Nancy had no time to notice when she had aged so much. She didn't even notice when her life turned into a real survival of the fittest. "Nancy, what's wrong with you?" The doctor crept up from behind. The woman quickly turned around to face him. Even from behind his glasses, the fierce look of dark eyes could be seen. "You know very well yourself. You're not the first patient to complain about you. What are you getting paid for here?" "George, forgive me, Nancy," I began to justify myself. "You know my James is sick Kevin, he's The woman clutched at her heart. The doctor helped her into the nearest chair. He gently began the conversation. "I understand, Nancy. I understand perfectly well. But understand me and understand our patients. If I'm in your position all the time, maybe it's time you stepped into mine. I've already had 2 regulars this week who switched from signing up with Anatoly to me. You do realize that you and I are losing our legitimate raises because of this." Nancy guiltily, she lowered her head. "It won't happen again. I promise I'll be careful. No one will ever complain about me." The doctor sighed and shook his head. "Tell me how many hours you slept this night as well." Nancy hesitated for a moment. "I don't. And how are you, my dear, going to work carefully if you can't even get a good night's sleep?" "Nancy, we're not making sausage in a factory. I'm a doctor. These are living people. It's important and necessary to be attentive, focused, and careful." The woman remained silent. Her gaze was fixed on the floor. George exhaled loudly. "That's it. I'm not going to fire you. I know how much you need the money." Nancy raised her head. She looked gratefully at her boss. "Thank you, I wasn't finished. He's been hanging around for a while. I'll give you a couple weeks off to drink. Take care of your family. Take care of your problems. We'll see what happens from there." "George, I'm a doctor," I interrupted a woman. "Nancy, that's it. You're free to go." "What am I going to do without money?" "I need to work. I need to feed my family." The doctor's eyes rounded with surprise. He took off his glasses, rubbed his arm, and shifted. "You're married, Nancy. Maybe you're earning money, I suppose. That's it, go now. I've got an appointment coming up. And I still have to find a free assistant. You're on paid vacation for 2 weeks. Don't come back before then. We'll see about that." He put his glasses back on and walked briskly. He left the office. Nancy cupped her face with her hands. That meant the conversation was over. The woman walked home. It was late spring. The fruit trees were covered in white branches. The grass was getting stronger and stronger. Nancy turned into the yard to shorten her driveway. Usually she took the bus home, but today even $3 couldn't be extra now. Money was getting scarce. Nancy's salary was the only steady income in the large family. George was right. The woman was indeed married, except for her husband. He couldn't be relied on at all. He didn't have a steady job. There wasn't a month that went by without a man holding down a job until the end and getting scandalously fired. He tried honestly, found some part-time work, but every time he failed. He drank like hell and couldn't go to the workplace anymore. He swore he wouldn't drink anymore, crawled on his knees. But every time, the same scenario happened over and over again. He drove, came to his senses, found a new job, and went back to drinking. Nancy had given up hope for him. She lived with him out of inertia, after all, 2 kids and 25 years of marriage. And there was nowhere to go. The family's only property was a small 1-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. Nancy's life was difficult, depressing, and one might even say unbearable. Nancy kept walking. She walked along long gray 5-story buildings surrounded by a patch of swords, unevenly sheared from the bushes by a couple of weeds. Now and then bumping into local alcoholics and other marginalized people. The sun was already setting. Nancy passed by a playground where some noisy group of teenagers were sitting. She looked in their direction and was horrified. The young boys were drowning in cigarette smoke. Each of them had a bottle of beer or some other alcoholic beverage. The woman raised her eyes to the sky and said to herself, God, if only Kevin were home, if only Kevin were from the playground, came a drunken boy's voice. Kevin, bet you can't drink a bottle of whiskey in one gulp. Her oldest son, Kevin, a 10th grader, had gotten involved with some bad company lately. She's punished her son, kept him home, deprived him of money, but all to no avail. The teenager, sure that parents do not understand anything, ran away and openly spit on the moral teachings of his mother. At first, when he was just beginning to enter the difficult age of transition, Nancy prayed that her son would not start smoking. A couple days later, she found a pack of cigarettes in his room. Then the woman feared to her heart's content to discover that her son had tried alcohol, especially with such a heredity. Thought the woman was a week away. A drunken Kevin was brought home by some suspicious men. Now Nancy's praying to God for something else. For God to get Kevin off drugs. But sadly, her prayers were not answered. Toward the end of the school year, she received a call from the school informing her that Kevin had been spotted doing something strange in the restroom. The woman barely managed to convince the principal not to call the police to the school. But her son was not promoted to 11th grade. The woman cried, urged Kevin to come to his senses, to stop smoking, quit pot, to study. But he just brusquely waved his mother away. It turned out that he stopped going to school at the end of winter. The boy did not appear at home every day either. The woman cried and prayed and cried. She didn't know how else she could influence her son. Hearing the name of her oldest child, Nancy stopped. Staring, straining her eyes to the point of pain, she hoped it wasn't her eldest son there amongst the rowdy bunch of bullies, some other Kevin's alien, wayward child. With all her might, she began to listen to the conversation on the playground. Make that too. Laughing, the teenager replied. The woman's heart clenched with pain. She recognized the voice. It was her son. With deliberate confidence, she walked toward the playground, shouting loudly to Kevin, Kevin, go home. A stern tone reprimanded the woman as she approached the children. The teenagers laughed loudly. Some jumped up and ran away. And some continued to sit there, holding out their beers. Maybe the parents of those kids didn't care about them. Or maybe they couldn't handle the situation as well as Nancy herself. Kevin yelled at his laughing friends and moved toward his mother, his staggered cigarette in his hand. Don't embarrass me, get out of here, snapped the teenager. Son, let's go home. What are you doing here? You still have to take exams next year to enter the institute. Nancy tried to take her son's hand. He brusquely waved it away. Leave me alone. I don't give a shit about your institute. He spat loudly on the ground. Kevin, you wanted to be an economist. The woman started to lose her temper. I'm a mom. Are you delusional? Get off. He turned around, shouted to his friends to leave. The company obediently got up and followed him. Tears came to Nancy's eyes. She stared at her son's back for a long time. Unable to change anything when he disappeared around the corner, the woman went home. She realized that after such a scandal, Kevin would not come home for a long time. Nancy entered the apartment. She took off her shoes and slipped her feet into tattered old slippers, walked through the narrow hallway, stopped in the bathroom, washed her hands, and found herself in the kitchen. Right at the table, leaning on her arms, bent over, sat her precious husband. He was snoring loudly, and next to him stood an empty whiskey bottle. The woman looked around the room, shabby all-in-darkness walls once painted in a pleasant turquoise color, old, yellowed refrigerator from the old days, dirty with black spots of chips and painters, the bathroom, the sink. She closed her eyes powerlessly. She wanted the old apartment to magically turn into a new one with a beautiful modern interior. Lately, the woman had been dreaming of renovation, but there was no way to do it. And how all this money, a lot of money. And as you know, this very money in the family did not have. So what should she do? She exhaled loudly and opened her eyes. The interior hadn't changed. In front of her still rose a mountain of unwashed dishes and the same dirty blue-gray walls. Her husband hadn't changed either. He was also lying with his head on the table, and that head of his had not at all grown back his curly hair. She poked her husband lightly on the shoulder and shouted, "Frank, Frank, get up." The man raised his head, looked around the kitchen with a blank, uncomprehending stare. He mumbled something and dropped his head back on the table with a clatter. After a couple seconds, he clapped again. Nancy waved his hand irritably in his direction. I reached into the refrigerator, pulled out a pot of uncomplicated and simple food, put it on the stove to heat. I put the food on 2 deep plates for myself and my youngest son. Ran to change into home clothes, quickly put on an old, confused robe, returned to the kitchen, put the plates on a tray, and headed for the small room. Turn off the kitchen light beforehand. Let her husband sleep at the kitchen table tonight. She went into her son's room, where the youngest sat staring at an old computer screen. "James, hi." She walked forward, placing a plate of dinner in front of her son. "How are you?" "Hi." The boy looked away, then stared at the monitor again. "What's up, Daddy got drunk again?" James asked in as casual and calm a tone as if he were wondering what was for dinner today. "Drunk, drunk." Nancy answered thoughtfully. "Have you done all of today's assignments?" "Didn't forget anything?" the woman inquired. Her youngest son could not go to school due to illness, so he was homeschooled. "Haha," replied the boy and immediately wailed loudly. "They killed me." He slapped his hand on the keyboard in frustration. "You interrupted the offender," said James. The woman looked sadly and reproachfully at her son. He looked down guiltily and calmed down. She moved the plate to her son. "Eat, or it'll get cold. Now I have to go to the bathroom." The boy reached for his crutches, trying not to touch anything on the table. While still very young, James had suffered a severe injury. He broke his femoral neck while bicycling. It took the boy a long time to recover. His entire childhood was spent in the walls of all kinds of hospitals, but unfortunately, the femur fused incorrectly, depriving the child of the ability to move independently. James needed an expensive operation, and for the last few years, the family tried to save the necessary amount of money for it. But the money was saved with great difficulty. The father of the family at some point became drunk, and Nancy's salary was not enough even for the normal maintenance of the whole family. What was there to save? Nancy had a strong feeling that with each passing day, the chances of making James undergo an operation were getting farther and farther away. After all, it was impossible to save up, and there was no opportunity to have such an operation free of charge. Nancy held out her hand to her son. "Let me help you." Did the boy accept? No, I clumsily got up on crutches and left the room. Nancy took a moment to look around again. After all, this was the room James shared with Kevin. She ran her eyes over the table, ran her hand over her eldest son's bed, squatted down, and looked under the bed. A small package caught her eye. The woman took it out and unwrapped it. It was a tiny black woman's purse. I think they called it a stool. Nancy jabbed painfully. A horrible guess. The son of a thief. Not that she dumped the contents directly onto the floor. In the bag were a few crumpled bills and some sort of bag of white powder. The woman only let out a quiet gasp. It was undoubtedly drugs. She angrily stuffed the entire contents of the bag back in, opened the window, and what was the point of tossing the find into the distance? That's when her youngest son came back into the room. He, noticing the change in his mother's mood, cautiously inquired, "Mom, why me?" Nancy's eyes went black. She slowly settled down on the table. "James, have you noticed something strange in Vanya's behavior?" the woman asked the teenager. The boy visibly changed, frowned, turned his face away. I'm hungry, he said quickly. "Let's go to the kitchen." Nancy covered her face with her hand and spoke in a weak voice. "No, Daddy's asleep. Let's go here." The next morning began rather unusually. For the first time in a long time, Nancy was not in a hurry to go to work. She woke up to bright sunlight, as usual, around 6 o'clock, a perennial habit, and made her way to the bathroom. Washed herself cursorily, trying not to look at the cracked sink and the affected condensation-covered pipes. The sight of his own bathroom caused Nancy nothing but disgust. Since it itched, she put on an old robe, yawning. The woman went out into the kitchen. The husband was still asleep. It seemed he hadn't even changed his posture since last night. Nancy gingerly approached her spouse, touched the pulse on his neck. Alive! It went through her head, and the woman exhaled with relief. She took in a breath of air and said firmly to Frank, "Frank, get up," and shook her husband by the shoulder. The man jerked, raised his head, and finally his eyes became conscious. "Why are you yelling?" "Oh," Frank gently touched Sands for water. "Pour it yourself." Nancy pressed her lips together. "What is it this time? What's up with your job? I almost got fired. You're gonna have to support your family." "Fired how?" Frank was genuinely surprised. "And how are we going to live before we're fired?" Nancy grumbled unhappily. "I'm telling you almost." "Are you even listening to me?" She rolled her eyes. "God, what a jerk. What's going on with your job?" "I repeat with work," he was thinking. It was like he was remembering something that happened a long time ago, when in fact he had the job yesterday. "So I got fired, that's what. And you, of course, not your fault," ironically muttered the woman. At this moment she was pouring boiling water over instant coffee in the couch. "And bad from this cup is not my fault." Frank did not understand the sarcasm. "Well, drank a shot in the morning to avoid a headache. That's all. And who are they? The bosses? Who else? They've dealt with it, fired someone, even if they didn't understand the situation. Fucking Frank, what's there to deal with? You can't drink in the workplace." She got angry and put the mud on the table. Dark brown liquor spilled out, staining everything around her. "I know your shot. Bottle minimum. Fucking alcoholic." She wrinkled her nose. Frank looked out the window, still unable to get up from his seat. "Fucking hell," the man repeated after his wife. "That's right." He slapped his forehead loudly, then grimaced at the pain in his temples. "Mother will be here soon." "I completely forgot to tell you what," Nancy wondered. She looked at her husband questioningly, raising her mug. "Your mother. What else would she be?" "She called about a week ago, saying she was coming to visit us soon." "I almost completely forgot to warn you." He smiled indignantly. "Well, pour some water." "Fuck you," shouted the woman. "We don't need your mother, we have enough problems without her." She rushed around the room, spilling you the remaining coffee. "Tell me where are we gonna put her? We don't even have a bed for her." "I'll think of something," Frank said hesitantly. "You better think of a job." The woman snapped at him. The conversation between the couple was interrupted by their youngest son. "What are you doing, Peter? I can't listen to this." The boy looked frightened, pleased. Nancy was pointing his finger at his husband. "Scared the kid." "No, tell me, are you happy?" "Mom, you started it." James stood in the kitchen doorway, leaning on his crutches and trembling hands shakily supporting him, swaying from side to side. "Sorry, son, just your daddy." Nancy took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down. "Come, eat your porridge and let's go for a walk. You need some fresh air. Do you?" She shifted her gaze to her husband. "Look for a job immediately." The woman walked, embarrassed, past her son, out of the kitchen. The boy followed her. "I'll find one," enthusiastically said Frank, left in the room completely alone. Having finished their walk, Nancy and James returned home dragging the teenager, along with his crutches, into the entryway was completely inconvenient. And the woman once again spoke unkindly of her husband. "Your father should have come down to help us," resented Nancy, puffing, lifting her son up the stairs. "Mammy, but you asked him to?" suggested the son. "And now? Can't he figure it out for himself?" Nancy continued to grumble. "Okay, we're almost home." They finally got up, entered the apartment, and stood like a stumbling block. Straight from the kitchen came the chiming and cheerful voice of Nancy and her mother-in-law. "Not again," quietly whispered Nancy. "Mama, Grandma?" James asked. He looked questioningly at his mother. "It looks that way, son." Of course, James had seen his father's mother before. It was just that it had been so long ago that he hardly remembered her at all. And the teenager has only ghostly, fragmentary memories of his grandmother. How, even before his injury, he had been running and jumping merrily across the green lawn and being a visitor to her in the village. Nancy, on the other hand, of course, remembered her mother-in-law very well. Once before the birth of their eldest son, the newlyweds had lived in this very village with Frank's parents. Then they bought an apartment in the mortgage, moved to the city, and communication with her mother-in-law almost came to naught. With her mother-in-law, Nancy called rarely, only on holidays. She never listened to what Frank's mother tried to advise, only answered on duty, clasping the phone receiver between her shoulder and ear. Yes, of course she did. Frank, on the other hand, had been in contact with his parents more often since his father's death. He began to visit his mother occasionally in the village, helping out with the household chores. The eldest son, Kevin, remembered his grandmother well, but he probably didn't care about her. Family ties, for some unknowable reason, were not particularly meaningful in Nancy and family. V, and helping her son do the same. Nancy tried to pull herself together. She inhaled deeply and exhaled several times, gritted through her teeth. "Honey, go say hi to Grandma." And after the teen obediently pointed toward the kitchen, the woman stealthily skipped into the bathroom, quickly washed her hands. Half-water and tired face ran a comb through her hair. She opened her eyes wide a couple of times, trying to control the painful sensations, and firmly told herself to calm down, looked at her reflection once again, and giving herself a promise not to say anything rude to her mother-in-law, even accidentally, entered the kitchen with everyone else. "Clara, am I glad to see you?" Nancy smiled and lied to her mother-in-law directly into her eyes. The mother-in-law smiled widely. She was already sitting upright in her favorite chair in a masterly manner. Nancy thundered from the bread from the biggest cup she found in the house. The tea quickly assured, in bags long, rustling skirt seemed to take up all the surrounding space. "Nancy, darling." "Hi. Hi." The woman gestured with her arms spread wide, urging Nancy to come over and hug immediately. Reluctantly, Nancy approached and hugged the seated sailor, her immediately fiber a rather pleasant smell. Her mother-in-law smelled a complex range of scents that guessed leftover milk blackcurrant and something else sort of herbal. Nancy smiled involuntarily for a moment, back to the distant countryside of her youth. "Do you realize that my grandson doesn't remember me at all?" I had to reacquaint myself with my own grandson. Clara laughed good-naturedly. "Where is the eldest? Where's Kevin?" Nancy was embarrassed. She turned away and began to wash the dishes. Out, she finally got it out. "How long will you be staying with us, Mom?" In a deliberately careless way, Nancy asked. "That's so. I don't know yet. It's hard to say." "Well, Frank, get my bag. I've brought you some goodies." Grandma smiled and clapped her hands loudly. Nancy and her son shuddered at the same time. The woman seemed to be thinking to herself, "Lord, she's so loud." Frank had already obediently brought a huge wheeled bag into the kitchen, from which Clara began to take out some jars and whistles. That's how her mother-in-law listed everything that was extracted from the vast depths of her swamp. "Here are strawberries, and this is from black currants. Milk, fresh bread." She sighed noisily at the smell of bread, lifted it close to her nose, and laughed loudly. "All about her own, I beg to differ. Yep, and this one we have goat." As Clara continued to pull more and more groceries out of the bag, Nancy bore a stern look from her husband. He caught her judgmental gaze and shrugged guiltily, saying, "I had nothing to do with it." James flapped his eyes in surprise. "Grandmother, why did you bring all these groceries? Did they pass the required health inspection?" The grandmother laughed even louder than the usual grandson. "That's what it means to spoil a child, the city and computers. Look, don't you give me any other checks. I told you fresh." The loud voice of the mother-in-law clearly bounced off the walls. "That kind of ping-pong ball." She laughed. She said, "Well, grandson, don't talk like an old grandfather to your mom." But look how Frank jumped, but quickly regained a serious expression under the stern look of his wife. Nancy mumbled, "Excuse me, I have to go," and stormed out of the kitchen. Running to the bedroom, she slammed the door loudly behind her, went to the window, and stared at the tree branches sticking out in different directions. Her mind was spinning. Why? Why did you come here? Nancy beat her hands against the windowsill with force. It couldn't be said that Nancy hated her mother-in-law. Rather, the woman simply couldn't understand or accept her. It seemed to her that Clara was too boisterous, too frivolous, and in some ways uninspired by her mother-in-law's rustic lifestyle. And her household inclinations were also incomprehensible to her. What the hell is poplar milk? She thought irritably. What if there is some kind of E. coli in it? And who's going to drink it? It will stay in the refrigerator. We'll throw out all these jokes of my mother-in-law. Her inappropriate laughter, straightforwardness, bordering on tactlessness in Nancy's view, and overly noisy voice caused the landlady only irritation. She was tired of Clara. Even during a 5-minute conversation on the phone, she could not even think of living with her again under the same roof. Gradually, Nancy calmed down a little, walked across the room, and flopped down face down on the bed. She thought it unlikely that her dear mother-in-law would deign to add some money to the family budget and feed her at her own expense. She quietly weighed bent with indignation, ducking her face into the pillow. At that moment, there was a loud knock on the door. Without waiting for permission to enter, Clara burst into the bedroom with a brisk step, looked around, and said in a loud voice, "What's up with her, Nancy?" Nothing in confidence. And again she laughed disgustedly. Nancy sat down on the bed, lost her face with her hands. Of course, in confidence nothing. She smiled languidly. She could not tell her mother-in-law of her displeasure. She was raised to respect her elders. No offense to me, honey, but you look a little too tired and panic-stricken. Maybe you should take a vacation. Nancy was indignant to the core. She was silent. For a few seconds, trying to swallow her resentment, and then she exhaled and said quietly to Clara, "Darling, but where will I go? Who will I leave the whole household to?" "Who? Me, of course." The mother-in-law patted her daughter-in-law cheerfully on the shoulder. "Nancy was surprised at you." "No, not at all. It's not worth it for my sake to stay longer than you planned. Especially since I'm on vacation as of today." My mother-in-law smiled. "It's true. What a lucky coincidence for you. Vacation is very, very important. Why were you sitting at home then?" Nancy started to explain that the vacation was not planned. Suddenly, she heard the front door open. She cried out Kevin and ran to meet her son. Clara, surprised by this reaction, followed her. "Kevin, where have you been? Why haven't you been home?" Nancy began to reprimand her son. The boy didn't even look at his mother. Then his grandmother came out of the room. She shouted happily to her grandson, "Kevin, what a grown-up you have become. What a handsome man." And the grandmother, without even letting Vanya change his shoes, came to him with hugs. "Grandma, what are you doing here?" Unhappily kicked the teenager. He reluctantly embraced Clara and in the next minute already disappeared behind the doors of his room. The women looked at each other. Nancy ran after her son. She stepped confidently into the room, and before she could open her mouth, she saw Kevin rummaging under his bed. The woman flashed a glare. "What are you looking for by any chance? A black purse? Where did you get it?" Kevin wanted to answer, but Nancy interrupted him. "You stole it. Come on." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes. Her voice broke into a scream. "More drugs. Kevin, shame on you. Think about your father and me." Clara appeared in the doorway and gasped and clutched at her heart. When she heard the screams, Frank and James came in as well. There was a tense silence in the room. Kevin, without saying a word, explained the relatives and left the apartment in a flash. Nancy, wiping away her tears, looked helplessly at her family. The first to raise her voice was Nancy's mother-in-law. "Oh my God, you're sure I'm sorry." Nancy, I myself didn't understand exactly what she was apologizing for. She ran her hand through her hair, returned her voice to its usual calm. Then James, "Let's go outside. Honey, let's take another walk." She walked out of her children's room. Her youngest son stood up on his crutches and obediently dragged himself after her. The next week passed relatively quietly. The in-laws made their beds in the kitchen, laying out the old and already well-worn couch. Kevin still made occasional appearances at home. He didn't say anything or explain anything. He looked okay, but he mostly dropped by to spend the night or to get something to eat. Nancy was at home most of the time because of her forced vacation. She didn't really have anywhere to go, no reason to, The woman thought. All her vacation consisted in walking with her invalid son. After all, he needs to be outdoors as often as possible, to walk, to develop his hips. Life with Clara seemed unbearable for Nancy. She was fed up with her left-handed mother-in-law, nagging her daughter-in-law time and time again, receiving her as if she were a 20-year-old girl again. She taught Nancy how to do the dishes, taught her how to cook, taught her how to clean. One fine morning, she even stormed into the bathroom and pointed out to Nancy that she wasn't brushing her teeth properly. The woman was filled with anger. How ridiculous of the old woman to teach me, she thought to herself. Nancy said patiently out loud, "Thank you for the tip." What annoyed her most of all was not even the mother-in-law's moralizing, but the look with which she presented it. The opposite side of the dance, eternally loudly ready, all her reproaches served under the guise of touching care. Nancy was getting sick of such hypocrisy. However, on proper reflection, she herself was to some extent hypocritical. Instead of expressing her displeasure to her relative, she smiled good-naturedly at her face and nodded, agreeing with every word she said. Frank went on a bender again and disappeared for 3 days. When he returned, he devoted all his time to eating, sleeping, and watching television. But Nancy gave him credit. Her husband, when necessary, stood up for his wife, gently putting his mother in her place. "Mother, really?" "Nancy will teach her how to be a snot," Frank said. The sons, for their part, were as displeased with their grandmother as their mother. Once in a while, Kevin would come home and find their grandmother in the kitchen, humming loudly, and the pies in the big frying pan were smoky and smelled unbearable. It was burning with oil. True, the pies came out delicious. James was extremely dissatisfied with the fact that his grandmother constantly tried to deprive him of computer games. "Grandson, why don't you read a book?" she'd tell him. James only waved it away irritably. He was more interested in playing a shooter game. Once he said to his grandmother, "You don't understand, but at least in the game I can run." After this phrase, Clara, as it was hushed, thought, and left his youngest grandson alone. Time went on its way. The fragile white apple blossoms fell, and summer came. Nancy dreamed of only one thing, that her mother-in-law would leave as soon as possible one warm summer evening. The woman sat at the table in her kitchen, absent-mindedly watching some TV show and watching the soup simmering on the stove. The mother-in-law came into the kitchen on an empty stomach. "Who cooks like that?" Sitting there like an urn on the spot. She laughed at her dainty joke. "Go ahead and get some rest. I'm talking to you." And then off to the side. Nancy to herself forth the news, and aloud said Clara, "I'm dreadfully tired. I've only just sat down at all. You're not taking care of yourself. Go, I say, rest. I'm on you. I'm cooking." Nancy exhaled heavily and was tired of her mother-in-law trying to smoke her out of the kitchen. She chose her words carefully and quietly said, "Why are you always trying to get me out of the kitchen?" Clara opened her mouth, pulled out astonished, but did not have time to answer because Frank entered the kitchen. "Good evening, ladies." The man was neatly shaved. He smelled surprisingly pleasant. He seemed to be completely sober. "Frank, is that you?" Nancy theatrically carried the palm card. "That the drink is over. How long until the next one?" Nancy chuckled quietly into her fist. Frank was embarrassed, hushed, looked at his mom, searching her eyes for support. Then, in a cheerful tone, he said, "I'm going on a business trip. I'm leaving Nancy for Washington." He fixed the edge of his t-shirt. "I wish I could feel a little encouragement from my own wife." Did Nancy, laughing, shake her head? "What's next, Frank?" "You'll be back in a week, and you'll drink all the money you've earned. If they pay you back, of course, and I'll have to pay your way. We've been there." Clara, watching the couple arguing, "Frank, I'm very happy for you. You're going to the Capitol. You really should say something nice." There you go, picking up on your mother's words. A man learned from his mother how to behave with his husband. Nancy went into a frenzy. It flashed through my mind. "So live with your mom." Out loud, the woman said, "As usual, good luck, Frank." She went to the stove, turned off the burners, and silently left the kitchen. First, the forced Nancy of the new vacation of the fallen. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since her mother-in-law's arrival. Nancy was already boiling like a hot single kettle. Clara had already driven her completely crazy with her presence. Kevin still came home occasionally. Only now he was harassing his mother. Well, when Grandma's going to leave? The teenager kept repeating. James was expectedly not happy either. Frank was the only one who was walking around in high spirits, preparing for his imminent departure to Washington. On another Monday, Nancy, after doing all the housework and taking a walk with her youngest son, got ready and headed to work by 1 o'clock. She ventured out for the first time in a long time to put on some makeup, let her hair down and lightly bobbed, and all to show the bosses I've had a 100% rest. Nancy hoped George would take pity on her and allow her to resume her duties. She'd given the dentist advance notice. The woman arrived at the clinic. She knocked. She entered the office. "George, hello. How are you here without me?" Vacation assistant did not smile in the whole mouth, demonstrating her excellent health. The stern-looking doctor sat behind a wide, perfectly white desk. He raised his head, tearing his gaze away from the papers. "Ah, Nancy, hello, hello, hello. Come in, sit down." The woman obediently sat down. The smile continued to shine on her thin lips. The muscles of her face were almost cramped with excitement. Without waiting for the doctor's rejoinder, she gently asked, "So, George, when can I start work?" The dentist frowned and looked at his assistant carefully. He slid his gaze over her face, and it made Nancy feel even more uncomfortable. Finally, he asked, "How was your rest?" "Fine." Nancy nodded cheerfully. "I feel great. Thanks for the vacation. And where were you?" Nancy hesitated and quietly replied, "Home." The doctor shook his head reproachfully. "Nancy, I didn't just send you on vacation for nothing. You were supposed to be resting, recovering. And you're what?" He adjusted his glasses, touching the frames. "You look even more tired." Honestly, the woman was embarrassed. The smile disappeared of its own accord. George continued, "No makeup will help. I can see your condition. Nancy, you're tired as hell. I realize my son is sick, but that's no reason to beat yourself up like this." He got up from his chair. He stepped closer to the assistant, leaned against the edge of the desk. "You realize that your chronic fatigue affects not only you, but also those around you. It affects our patients first and foremost." He stood up and walked around the office with his hands behind his back. "I'll tell you something else, not as your immediate superior, but as a friend. Your chronic fatigue is taking its toll on your family. Think about what I'm saying. In the meantime, I can't allow you to assume your duties. Get some rest. Better yet, go somewhere for at least a week." Nancy was getting very angry. I thought to myself, what the hell am I going anywhere for? "You're so clever," she said out loud. "Swallow your resentment and anger again." "All right, I did." She got up heavy, brushed off a non-existent dust from her clothes, glanced at the doctor. "When can I start working?" "When you realize you've rested, slept, cleaned up. You'll know when that happens." He looked at her closely again. "Doesn't make me fire you. Go on. Goodbye, George. Have a nice vacation." Disappointed, panic-stricken, and even humiliated, Nancy once again walked home along the familiar road. Money was running out in spite of her austerity. "I'll have to borrow again," Nancy thought. "And we haven't paid off our previous debts yet." She could hear the cheerful and happy voices every now and then. People around her were laughing and talking animatedly, enjoying the good weather. Some woman exclaimed, "Look, Andrew, what flowers do you see? They weren't here before." Nancy unconsciously threw a dissatisfied glance at the flowered, which the stranger admired. The flowered was indeed excellent, except that Nancy had absolutely nothing to do with it. All her thoughts were preoccupied with problems, difficulties with the work of her son's upcoming surgery, which it seemed they would never do. Not seeing anything around from the tears that had returned to her eyes, she herself did not notice how she came to her house. Her husband had left on his business trip as early as the morning before, leaving Nancy alone with her problems, just as he always did. Only now her mother-in-law was added to them. To make it easy for her, she never even bothered to explain why she brought it from her village. The woman stopped at the front door and hesitated. She didn't feel like going home at all. She knew that as soon as she crossed the threshold of her own house, her mother-in-law would immediately start harassing her. Slowly, she decided to enter the apartment quietly, unnoticed, so that she would not immediately realize that her daughter-in-law had already returned. Nancy quietly opened the front door, changed her shoes, and began to rejoice in her son's room. Her goal was almost accomplished as suddenly something in her mother-in-law's voice carried all the way from the kitchen. It caught her attention. She went back to the kitchen door lurking and listened. The mother-in-law was talking loudly to someone on the phone, giving her a loud chagrin every now and then. Nancy rolled her eyes but continued to eavesdrop. Oh yes, of course, Clara was laughing loudly into the receiver of her cell phone. There wasn't much time left. Nancy nestled even closer to the door, just a little more, and she would run out herself, losing her slippers. The old woman was talking even louder than usual. Nancy noted sarcastically to herself that she thought it would make the connection better if she yelled. Suddenly, Clara said something that made the landlady's mouth dry and almost stopped her heart. "We'll be rid of our Nancy soon enough." There was another rude, loud cackle. Nancy stood frozen in place like a stooped man. Her lips were quivering with resentment and anger. Her whole body was covered with cold. Then the woman shook. Who was this old woman talking to? Could it be to Frank? Fearful speculation. Kevin thrust into her heart like sharp knives. Frank, how could you? Nancy was on the verge of hysterics. She had already stopped listening to her mother-in-law's phone chatter. She hadn't noticed when she ended the conversation. Shocked by what she had heard, the unfortunate tried to pull herself together to take away the trembling in her knees. She squared her shoulders as best she could. She took a deep breath and with a confident jerk opened the door leading to the kitchen. Explain yourself at once. Took the bull by the horns. Nancy, I heard who you were talking to. Clara jumped in Nancy's seat in surprise. Why do you have to be so scary? Am I that annoying to you? Are you trying to give me a heart attack? Clara laughed nervously, but she didn't look the way a person should look after so many days on the scene. Still just as carefree relaxed. Nancy for a moment even marveled and perhaps envied the appearance of composure and equanimity in her mother-in-law. This woman, even without knowing her vivacious, cheerful character, could in no way be called an old woman. And even an elderly, ruddy, riding healthy face almost wrinkle-free. So fine mesh around the eyes figure is still okay. Strong on the mannequin, of course, does not pull. Nancy noted to herself with a chuckle. But you can't call her a pillow either. Even the gray hair is almost imperceptible in the dark, shiny hair. What does she wash it with? Nancy thought absent-mindedly, and immediately remembered her mother-in-law's countless instructions about milk masks and nettles. And the bandages in them, apparently there is some good in it after all. She shook herself out of her non-local reverie, which was surely nothing more than a side effect of the shock she had just suffered. Nancy was shaking his head violently. Explain yourself. She repeated her demand more like an order. Out of breath, she stood in the middle of the kitchen, breathing heavily and clenching her hands into fists. Honey, what exactly did you hear? I don't understand. You'll have to forgive me, old woman. Nancy rolled her eyes. Don't pretend. I just heard you say you were going to get rid of Nancy soon. Who were you talking to? The mother-in-law chuckled nastily and said Nancy's sister-in-law's name in a long voice. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. You should definitely take a vacation, get some rest. You're dreaming up such passions. Who do you think I've been discussing such horrors with here? You were on the phone and stopped this circus. Nancy gestured angrily at the phone. It was lying next to its owner on the kitchen table. Clara clutched her head demonstratively. Poor girl. She picked up her glasses, hanging around her neck, pierced through a string. Put them on, picked up her old cot and her cell phone. Look, the last call I got was yesterday when I called my neighbor's place. What's wrong? You imagined it? The woman took her mother-in-law's phone in her hands. She looked, and indeed, the last outgoing call was yesterday morning. She returned the phone and thought. She wouldn't have had time to delete the call so quickly in the log. I just walked in out of the blue. And Clara kept broadcasting. How tired are you? My girl, how tired you are, poor little craftsman. Hurry up and get some rest. I'll cook everything myself and feed James. Nancy thought about it, helped, opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water from drinking directly from the neck, and quietly said, I don't believe you. You're always trying to send me away. Clara, but this is my home, and I'm not going anywhere, no matter how much you want me to. Do you have any idea how we live? I'm the only thing that keeps this place going. Don't you see how your son provides for his family? We've been trying to save up for James' surgery for over 4 years, and it's all for nothing. And Kevin? Nancy waved her hand. Her lips trembled, her cheeks flamed. She was about to have a real tantrum. Her mother-in-law got up from the sofa and, making soothing gestures with her hands, came up to her daughter-in-law and took her by the hands, despite her resistance. I'm telling you, it seemed. She said the last word loudly in syllables. Calm down, please. I'm telling you now, I'm telling you herbs useful. That again at work problems. Her voice sounded sympathetic and almost normal, without the usual naive cheerfulness of the topic translates. He's a bitch, Nancy thought, pulled away from her and a little slower, replied, I've extended my vacation. So you see. The mother-in-law clapped Nancy on the back with her hand, and she jumped in surprise. Clara spoke quickly, in her usual tone of voice. I've been telling you for years, you need a change of scenery. Your boss thinks so too. You can tell you're a smart man. Doctors aren't stupid. She sighed. That's it, go, dear. Don't bother me. Go and rest. Nancy threw her mother-in-law a suspicious look and silently walked out of the kitchen. The phrase she had heard a few minutes ago did not leave her mind. We'll be rid of our Nancy soon enough. Who the hell was she talking to? Why her? Does someone need to get rid of Nancy? Or is she really going crazy already? The woman went to her youngest son, did the usual things, moved around the room, asked mundane questions like how the boy was feeling, then cautiously began to question her son on a topic of interest. James, tell me, how do you like your grandmother? The boy set a disgruntled face. And here, and you do not know. I'm fed up with it. He looked around, lowered his voice. Why did she even come here? How much longer is she going to be here? She didn't say, Nancy answered. And then she wondered. Really, how much longer would she have to put up with her? James continued to resent her. He's lucky Pav's gone. I wish we could go somewhere else. What if she's here for good? The boy asked fearfully. Nancy frowned. I don't think so, darling. We'll try to find out tomorrow. The morning did not go well. All night Nancy tossed and turned, trying to get into a comfortable position and finally fall asleep. Sometimes the woman succeeded, but she slept. She was restless, constantly waking up for 30 or 40 minutes at a time. From the head never went away. Obedient conversation of the mother-in-law. Or maybe it really did show. Every time Nancy managed to sleep, after a while she woke up from nightmares. She dreamed of being kicked out of her home, of wandering the streets of the city like some kind of defense. Her mother-in-law laughing nastily at her. Get rid of Nancy. The woman kept repeating that phrase to herself. She couldn't understand what she had done to her husband's mother. She got up tired, lethargic, as her mind took in looking at herself in the mirror. It seemed to her that the dark circles under her eyes had gotten even darker. Even more so, she couldn't look at her reflection for more than 10 seconds. Finishing her morning routine, she walked to the kitchen. Her mother-in-law, already awake, was running briskly from the stove to the refrigerator, cooking something and humming at the top of her lungs. Good morning, Clara. Nancy, you're a man, smiled, pressed the kettle button. Good morning, Nancy. Oh, the mother-in-law had a look of shock on her face. What was she pointing at Nancy's face? What? Where? Nancy twisted in one place, ran her hand over her face, ran into the bathroom to the mirror. She yelled right from there. Clara, what is it? I don't see anything. Her mother-in-law unceremoniously followed her into the bathroom. How can't you see the writing? You look like you've been tortured all night. She frowned and folded her arms across her chest, waddling past the bathroom. James threw a sullen glance in his mother's direction. Thank you for noticing, Nancy said modestly and returned to the kitchen. She was tired of the constant insults from her mother-in-law, but she still didn't have the nurture to respond in the same manner. She poured instant coffee into a cup. The mother-in-law was alarmed. "Who does that?" "Take a spoonful straight from the jar." Nancy closed her eyes. She counted to 3 and took a deep breath. "Honey, how long are you staying with us?" "May I ask you for what purpose you have come?" The mother-in-law laughed. She walked over and snatched the boiling kettle out of her daughter-in-law's hands. "I'd better pour it. You're certainly now spread out." She carefully poured boiling water into the cup, and then finally answered, "I didn't just come here. I was called to your city church. They have a bishop's wife, seriously ill. I came to help. And you're all so tactful, so cautious. Why? Can't you see that I'm out every day until evening? What do you want to ask me where to?" She was silent. She stirred a little and spooned her tea and sighed. "For how long? It's hard to say. But I'll be with you for at least 6 months." There was a rumble and a loud creak. Hearing my mother-in-law's words, Nancy dropped the cup with hot coffee from his hands right on his lap. The mother-in-law immediately raised a shout. "How come, Nancy? How come?" She was rushing around the kitchen, looking for something to wipe up the spillage of the sticky drink. Nancy herself only repetitively repeated the words of her mother-in-law of 6 months and never cleaned up the broken crumb. She walked out of the kitchen. Quickly collecting James, Nancy walked out of the house with him. The boy's hip had been hurting more and more lately, so he went outside in a stroller. The woman rolled forward and thought deeply to herself, 6 months is a long time. The woman remembered overhearing the conversation and got angry. "Mom, what are you doing?" James inquired, looking up at the frowning mother from below. Nancy was silent for a long time, and then confidently answered her son. "You and I are going to leave this house. I can't stand living like this anymore." The woman swallowed the lump that came to her throat and quickly wiped a tear with her sleeve. The boy, frightened, asked where. "Where will we go, to your aunt? Do you miss Aunt Christina?" "Yes," replied James cheerfully. "We will go to her villa. We will." Nancy pulled out her cell phone, dialed her eldest son's number. Kevin didn't pick up, so she dialed again. Ringing, ringing. And then the call was dropped. She swore softly and asked the younger son, "Do you know where your brother is?" From where James answered, "Then let's go look for him," firmly said Nancy and turned the stroller the other way. Together with her youngest son, she spent several hours outside. The summer sun was shining brightly, and the wind seemed to have left their town for good. James had already started whimpering, repeating he still wouldn't want to leave with us. Let's go without him. But Nancy never gave up trying to find her eldest son. She looked in all the secluded courtyards of the city, in parallel called him on the phone. As the sun was nearing sunset, Nancy exhaled tiredly. They still hadn't found her. She texted her son saying they were leaving and asked him to arrive as early as possible at his aunt's villa. Kevin knew exactly how to get there. After that, they returned home without saying anything to their mother-in-law. She behaved as usual, grumbling something, laughing loudly, making flat jokes. Early the next morning, having packed the necessary things, Nancy and James left their home apartment. Nancy was not a sociable person, very modest. She had never had any close friends in her whole life. Almost one, though, and that was Nancy's own sister. And not just a sister, but a twin, as well as the other twins' girls from small years were inseparable everywhere, and always they were together. All through childhood, all through adolescence, and even the very beginning of adulthood, the sisters had been almost as one. Nancy often thought about how lucky she was to have a sister, how lucky she was to come into this world not alone, but with a true friend. She knew that Sister Christina was her soulmate. However, as time went on, the sisters were no longer as close to each other as they had been in their childhood and adolescence. Adulthood put everything in its prosaic place. Nancy fell in love with her future husband at the age of 16. At 18, she was already married. Christina, on the other hand, took a different path. After high school, she entered the Faculty of Economics. And after the university, immediately began to give all her time and energy to her own business. As a result, the sisters ended up on opposite sides of life. Nancy devoted herself to her family and Christina to business. It is worth noting quite successful and profitable business. Nancy arrived unannounced. She called her sister only when she and James were already standing at the gate of her large country house. There was a small and winding river running nearby, and the grounds themselves were surrounded by a thick and tall pine forest. The scent from the pine trees was magnificent. It seemed that the very air was here, especially after the bad city smog. Nancy pressed the video bell on the intercom, and in a couple of minutes the gate automatically opened, and Christina ran out to her sister. "How did I miss you?" Christina crouched down to James' stroller and hugged the boy tightly. Sis, she was coming to visit Nancy at her place. A long time ago, back when she was a baby. The sisters were constantly confused, even by their own family. Parents couldn't always tell where Christina was and where Nancy was. But things were different now. Nancy herself knew that she looked aged and tired, and even sickly. But she had never realized until today that she had been so frozen in place while her sister was happily counting something. She watched Christina. She was a young, undeniably beautiful woman, thick, short, light russet hair glistening in the sunlight. The bright sparkle of beautiful eyes, smooth, clear skin, straight posture, and perfectly tailored clothes confounded Nancy. She herself suddenly doubted that this beauty was her twin sister. Christina was dressed in loose beige slacks, a pull-back white tank top, emphasized a good figure, and thrown on top of a short and large knitted beige poncho. Added to the woman some special charm of Christina smelled good perfume with a floral bright fragrance. Nancy managed to recognize the smell of lilies along with the scent of sunny fresh peach. She discerned beautiful gold earrings in the shape of little swallows on her sister. Nancy shivered in embarrassment. Coughing into her fist, she said, "You look great, sis, just gorgeous." Christina smiled softly, stood behind the stroller, and rolled James onto the lawn. Nodding to her sister in the direction of the house, she walked forward. "Thank you, Nancy. What happened in there? You look so tired." The woman sighed heavily. I'm exhausted. The house is a mess. Frank's a heavy drinker. It's nothing new, but my mother-in-law has moved in." Christina wondered how she moved in. "Why'd you call her?" "That's the thing. No one called her. She arrived, unannounced, you might say." James jumped into the conversation. Grandmother had come to the church to help some woman. "We have to," Nancy nodded. "Our local priest's wife was sick, and she'd come to help her." Nancy chuckled. "Why didn't the priest put her up in his house?" "I wonder." Christina, an unbearable woman, stopped the stroller with her nephew and suddenly summarized. "But she seems to be kind." Nancy, noting to herself that Christina understood nothing and knew nothing, looked around the house. It was a large wooden building with a flat roof, made in the style of high-tech. Wide panoramic windows glistened with cleanliness, neat. Lush pine trees grew along the edges of the house. Of course, the woman had been to her sister's villa before. Now, however, she was visited by a slightly gloomy flying head. Like that genetic feeling, Nancy suddenly realized that she was terribly jealous of her own sister. The sisters were sitting in the large, beautiful living room. They were seated on opposite sides of a long white sofa. In front of it was a large fireplace with a long glass coffee table between the fireplace and the sofa. On it stood 2 pretty mugs and words of new tea. Christina reached for hers and took a sip, surprised to find herself holding it out. "Yeah, well, that's what she said. I don't believe it." She looked at her sister skeptically. "No, I've definitely heard that phrase." "That's what she said, that she wanted to get rid of Nancy." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Well, there's no way that could have happened. No way. Look, maybe she was talking about some other Nancy. And you should have found out right away, told her to her face." Nancy smiled sadly. "Don't be ridiculous. It was definitely about me. And there was no point in finding out about her. I tried, I tell you, but it got me nowhere." She picked up her cup of tea, twirled it in her hands. "What's all this for?" "Alki husband, mother-in-law, mom. And the children?" Well, prevailing stretched the sister. "But what kind of sons do you have?" "I have none, as you know." Christina sighed softly and looked sadly at the flames. "And we'll get James back on his feet very soon. I decided that I would give you money for the operation," she added suddenly. "I'm exhausted. No more watching the child suffer." Nancy quickly slammed his eyes shut, trying to chase the tears from the corners of his eyes. She opened her mouth to reply, but couldn't get a word out. Instead, she burst into violent tears, covering her face with her hands. The nurse moved closer, put her arms around Nancy, and quietly asked what was wrong. Little Nancy answered through her tears. "Everything all at once. There is not a penny of money at all. Frank is drinking away everything he earns, if you can even call it money, and I've been suspended from work. I've been home for 3 weeks on my own dime. I'm in debt like a silk. Christina and Kevin's mine." "Ah, what? I thought he was fine." Nancy burst into tears again. "My Kevin, he's a drug addict." Christina looked at her sister in shock. She couldn't believe her ears. The eldest of her nephews, the woman had always considered a strong, healthy, young guy, an athlete, handsome. And here was such news. Christina was simply speechless. Continuing to clutch her poor sister to her chest, Nancy spent the rest of the day in tears. She tried to pull herself together and didn't want her youngest son to see her in such a state. But it was all in vain. The tears themselves poured from her eyes in hail. Nancy saw how well her sister lived and did not understand what she was doing wrong. She looked sadly at the expensive interior, at her sister's chic appearance, and was torn to pieces. On the one hand, Nancy was happy for her, but on the other, she was pained to realize that her sister's life had turned out much better than her own. The next few days passed relatively quietly. Nancy took many walks with her son, breathing fresh air. She even went mushroom picking a couple times. She realized that she felt much better here than she did at home. With every breath she took, she became calmer, and the peace of mind that came with the change of scenery somehow faded into the background. After a few days, Nancy was ready to go back, but her sister insisted that both she and her youngest son stay with her in the country, and they did. Nancy continued to call her oldest son from time to time, but he was reluctant to answer his mother. Only once wrote, "Mama, I'm fine, don't call again." One day, the woman sellers about another failed conversation with her son and decided to leave Kevin alone. What can I do? Bitter, Nancy asked herself. Her heart was heavy, but she really didn't know what to do. It was an early, hot, sunny morning. James was feeling much better and expressed a desire to walk on crutches to the river. Nancy, along with her son, set out for the walk. They walked quietly along a narrow woodland path leading straight to a small local beach. They walked past tall pine trees, past other people's houses. Every now and then they bumped into large stones, and protruding from the sandy pathway studded and amber pine bark, yellow-green color of the pine forest. It was pleasing to the eye, soothing and filling with some unknown feeling. It was so serene here, birds hovered around. James would occasionally stop to point out to his mother a large fly agaric or blueberry bush. "Mom, look," the boy enriched himself on one of his crutches. With the other he poked in the direction of the berries. The woman stepped closer and plucked a handful of fresh blueberries. She handed the berries to her son and watched with pleasure as James flew them. The boy said dreamily, "I wish I could run down and pick them myself, and you could bring me berries and I'd turn my mother away." Tears came to her eyes again. She exhaled, answering son so and so. "Son, you'll see." They moved on. Nancy felt sad. She realized that she could not just take from her sister such a huge sum of money needed for the operation. What was she going to pay back with? Nancy walked slowly and kept wondering why the Lord had sent her such a punishment. When and with what she had managed to anger him so much. The fresh, damp smell of water hit her nose, smelling of wet wood and seaweed. With each step, it became easier to breathe, and little by little she began to feel dizzy. Nancy stopped and squinted. In the distance, the very beach could already be seen. The watery, greenish jubilant in the sunlight smoothness mingled near the horizon with the bright blue sky. The woman sighed and said happily, "Here we are at last." James wanted to clap his hands with joy, but he couldn't let go of his crutches. They walked out onto the empty, sun-drenched beach. The warm morning rays gently touched their skin. Somewhere in the distance, a small house rose up, and signs said that they could rent a boat there. Seagulls were flying around, and if you looked closely at the water, you could see a strong river current. James looked around happily and said, "Look, we're all alone out here." "Cool," he pointed toward the water, coming closer and closer. "Mommy, come here." Nancy jumped up, ran after the boy. "Careful," he laughed back. "It's all right." He stopped by the water and turned his nose, turned his head and looked closely at his mommy. "Maybe we're swimming. It's so hot outside." "No way." The woman shook her head negatively. "Look at the current. You won't be able to stay on the water. I will." The boy shouted angrily. "Relax, you'll be all right by now. If anything, you'll catch me." The woman approached and grabbed her son's hand. He swung awkwardly to the side. She said sternly, "Don't even think about it." "What if I don't succeed?" "You've washed that one out, haven't you?" Everyone went back to the house. James frowned. He shouted angrily, "You always ruin everything." Nancy was taken aback. She slammed her eyes shut and quietly with bitterness in her voice. "I asked spoiling things." The son didn't answer sullenly, staring into the sand. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to something behind Nancy's back. Following her son's gaze, she turned sharply in their direction. There was a man moving along the path. Judging by the figure, it was a man. Nancy shifted her gaze back to her son. "Ask the man what an idiot you are. Why are you looking at him like that?" "Mom, let's ask him to help back me up during the swim," James asked with hope in his voice. The woman answered before she could even hear her son's arguments. "No." "What are you saying? What if he's some kind of maniac? Or just a man who has no time for us? We will not talk to strangers. There's no chance of that." She nodded toward the woods. "Let's go home, son. We have a long walk." The boy mouthed forward disappointedly. "Always you are so afraid of everything and run around." "And we walk grudgingly," he said. Half an hour later, they returned home. "Sis, good morning. How was your walk?" Sister sat down next to Nancy. "Oh, don't even ask," Nancy exclaimed. "James is growing up and is beginning to show me his character." That's how Christina frowned. "Scoot closer." Nancy told her sister about their morning walk and dialogue on the beach. "Christina, well, how can I explain to him that I myself would like to swim and would like him to take a dip? But what? What can I do?" With sadness in her voice, the woman said. She bent her arm at the elbow and cocked her head. "It's not even my fault, really." Christina listened attentively to her sister as well. She got up, took a pear from her plate, twirled it in her hand, and asked Nancy thoughtfully, "Why do you keep saying you can't do anything?" Nancy hesitated for a moment. She got a little embarrassed, rolled her eyes at her sister. "What do you mean by that?" The woman sighed and smiled conciliatingly. "I mean that you're always saying time after time that you can't do anything about it, even though you don't even try." Nancy looked at Christina in surprise, forgetting about her coffee. She continued to express her pain. "Tell me, why were you afraid to meet that man? What if he really would have helped James to swim? After all, you could have taken your son for a ride." "I'm afraid my nephew was absolutely right. You've always been like that, afraid of everything and running around." Christina sat down very close to Nancy and took her hand. "You need to be more flexible over looking at things from different angles. You know what I mean. Relax." Nancy thought for a moment. She knew her sister was right, and she realized that no one but Christina would tell her the truth. The woman often refused to do something just because she was afraid. Her mother-in-law came to mind again. Why didn't I confront her right away? I ran away from my problems again. Sad, Nancy thought. Maybe I do need to be a little more free and decisive. Christina watched the expression on her sister's face carefully. She rose to her feet and said quietly to me, "It's time to fuck off. I have to go to work and check on things. I'll be back in a couple days. Think about what I said." A couple minutes later, Nancy heard the sound of a car. It went on, and Nancy was still visiting her sister. She didn't worry about work anymore, but eventually she would find another one. Who would want her there? Her husband, an alcoholic in town, or an older son who won't even talk to her? And most of all, probably her mother-in-law, who wanted to live, she succumbed. She thought about Christina's words for a long time, analyzing and thinking about it. The woman thought that she was indeed too modest, indecisive, soft-spoken, fearful, and anxious. It occurred to her that it would be a good idea to try to correct this. At one point, she even recognized that George was right. She really was in desperate need of rest. One evening, she even ventured to call her boss and thank him. The man was glad to hear his assistant. He praised the woman and told her to rest as long as necessary, noted Nancy's fresher and more alert voice, and hinted that she would make up for it later. The woman herself noticed a favorable change in herself. The black eyes had disappeared, the fine lines had resolved, and the deep wrinkles no longer looked like glow worms. Her posture straightened, her hair regained its luster, and the main thing in my soul, there was hope. Seemed to be based on nothing in particular, but it was beautiful nonetheless. Christina, back at the villa, talked Nancy into a trip to the beauty parlor. There the woman got a good haircut and dyed her hair a bright chocolate color. While at the salon, Nancy even allowed herself to exchange a few phrases with a girl she didn't know. The woman felt the taste of life again. She suddenly realized that she was ready to fight her problems with renewed vigor. Once again, she and James went for a walk to the beach. When they reached the water, James said with sadness in his voice that it was a pity I couldn't go swimming. Nancy wanted to agree that it was a shame, but she restrained herself. She looked into her son's eyes and said confidently, "We'll think of something." Suddenly a voice came from behind. "Hello, you must be our new neighbors. Let's get acquainted." A stout man approached them. He walked briskly and waved at them. His thick gray hair was neatly enrolled, and on his round face it was as if it was written that he was a good man. On a normal day, Nancy would certainly have immediately turned around and walked away. But today the woman decided to change her habits. She took a step towards him and extended her hand to the man. "Hello, my name is Nancy, and this is my youngest son, James. Pleased to meet you." The man gently took her hand and kissed it unexpectedly gallantly. All the blood came to Nancy's face from embarrassment, and as if he hadn't noticed it, he turned to the boy. "It's nice to meet you, young man. My name is Leo. I saw you here a couple days ago, but you ran away so fast. Catch up with what? There was no way to catch up with you." He laughed merrily. "You recently bought a villa from us here. Haven't seen you before." No, we're here visiting, staying with my sister. We're resting, regaining our strength. James needs fresh air. It's good for him to walk, to build up his muscles." "That's right. You are good," the older man said and patted the boy on the shoulder. James was a little embarrassed, but he dared to say something. "And you? Would you mind backing me up? I'd like to swim so much. I can do it. My arms are strong. But my mom, she's afraid for me. Why don't you just stick around?" Leo laughed good-naturedly, but before he could answer, he was interrupted by Nancy. No, not at all. We have no right to stress you out." The woman looked embarrassed and began to move strands of her lustrous hair. "I'm only in favor of it," Leo agreed cheerfully. "I was going to suggest it myself. I can assure you that amateur swimming is mostly hands-on, and it's not very deep. The current may seem strong, but it is deceptive. I'd be happy to help you." Nancy fell into a stupor. Her first thought was to say goodbye to that man, turn around and walk away, but moved by her fear for her son, she agreed. "Thank you, Leo. Let's give it a try." The woman helped her son off his extra clothes, took his crutches from him. Leo proved to be a sturdy man, though he was much older than Nancy. He put his shoulder to James for support, and they went into the water together. The boy was absolutely delighted. He laughed and twitched amusingly as the water reached first to his waist and then higher. Nancy was overjoyed for her son that such a small, modest dream had finally come true. After meeting Leo, Nancy began to keep in constant communication with him. They saw each other often, went for walks with James, and talked a lot. The woman enjoyed talking to such an intelligent man. He reminded her of George in some subtle way. In the course of another conversation, it turned out that Leo was also a doctor. He often asked the woman about her son's illness. He asked about the causes of the disease, about its complications. Nancy answered every question without hesitation. But when she finally learned that Leo was not just a doctor, but a professor and a leading orthopedic surgeon, she was shocked by such an unexpected gift of fate. The man gave them many recommendations, after the implementation of which James began to feel much better. One evening, Leo invited Nancy for a walk alone without James. He said he wanted to have a serious talk with her. Nancy happily agreed. And to her sister's reasonable question, what exactly would this conversation be about? She shrugged her shoulders absent-mindedly. How would I know? James did not object to this turn of events. He was happy to stay at home with Aunt Christina. Nancy, good evening. Leo smiled broadly at his companion. You look more and more beautiful every day. I must say Nancy smiled modestly and thanked him. Thank you. How are you doing? Leo, I'm fine. Went to my clinic today to check on the staff without me. Not a prankster. Can't be on vacation for too long, you know. We're workaholics. He laughed softly. There's something I wanted to talk to you about. Yes. Nancy looked at her companion carefully. During the conversation, they walked slowly along the neighboring plots, stopping now and then to take a closer look at a tree, a shrub, or a flower. I've been thinking about your case for a long time, and James is such a nasty injury and not well treated. Poor kid. In general, I consulted with colleagues, and we would like to offer you a high-tech operation using titanium fonts. In our city, this method is used only in our clinic. He stopped abruptly, looked Nancy in the eyes. Nancy lowered her gaze. Thank you, Leo. Thank you for your generous offer, but we can't afford it. We don't have any money at all. Nancy, she shook her hands dramatically. You've got me all wrong. I'm offering you the surgery for free. The woman was speechless. What do you mean? Free? She said shyly at last. It doesn't work like that. Leo answered her questions patronizingly and with favor in his voice. He spoke in the tone of voice that teachers usually use when patiently explaining a new topic to their students. Of course, there's no such thing as free. I meant free for you. I'll take care of all the expenses. Nancy was about to begin to retort. Her eyes flickered, and her hands shook slightly. But the man stopped her with one lordly gesture of his hand. Nancy, you don't have to worry about me. I'm not poorer for it. I can afford it. I'm interested in your case from the point of view of my research. So you can consider that by putting your son at my disposal, you will pay the clinic for the operation. He said firmly, you will have to come to my clinic next week. We'll do all the necessary tests there. We'll take the tests and set a date for the operation. Well, why don't you say something? Nancy couldn't believe her happiness. She had dreamed of this operation for so long. She knew just as well as James dreamed of being able to walk again. He often told his mother about his dreams. In them, the boy was running, going to school, playing sports. She stood there unable to get a word out of herself. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. But they were different tears, tears of real happiness. Finally, the woman spoke. Thank you. Thank you. I can't believe it. Leo, I'll pay you back the full amount. I promise. Leo put his hand up again, interrupting Nancy. If I wanted you to pay me back, I would have lent you the money. Please stop bickering. Think of your son, the man said, almost angrily, and pointed forward, inviting Nancy to continue their walk. Excuse me, oh, I'm sorry. The woman followed her interlocutor, trying to find the right words. So when can you come to the clinic? The doctor repeated his question. Nancy, I smiled gratefully. We are completely free. As you wish, the woman replied. Well, let's go then. He stopped talking, pulled out some kind of notebook, resigned to making notes. Let's do it this Wednesday. Okay. Later, I just don't know how to thank you. Leo smiled and held out his hand to her. The best thank you for me would be if you are in a good mood, and give it to your boy. On the way back, Nancy did not walk. She literally flew home, unable to feel her feet under her from happiness. And from time to time, she still stopped to pinch her arm. It seemed to her that everything that was happening around her was a beautiful dream. When she returned, she immediately told her sister about everything. What a stroke of luck. How lucky are we? Christina rejoiced. Nancy, I got some myself, but the same phrase kept running through her mind. Everything is for a reason. After some thought, Nancy decided not to tell her son about the operation. She didn't want to give him false hope. The tests would be bad or something. However, James himself realized that something good had happened. His mother was too happy and elated when she learned about Leo Pavlovich's proposal, which was presented to him as a complete examination. The excited boy sat up on the bed and clapped his hands. "Mommy, I feel that Leo will definitely help me. I will walk on my own again without crutches, without a stroller." "You will," Nancy answered him. She gently stroked her son's head and began to help him get ready for bed. It was deep into the night when Nancy sat alone in the silence of the Grand Palace. The sky was clear and starry. A light warm breeze faintly touched her face. The silence of the dacha village died away, made somewhere in the distance. Thinly and pitifully cried the unknown night birds. Nancy sat on the bench swing, admiring the clear sky, noting a familiar constellation. The smile never faded from her face. Suddenly, she thought she recognized a constellation of fish in the sky. The image of her husband immediately appeared in her mind. According to his zodiac sign, he was a fish. However, she was disappointed in him. Lately, she suddenly realized that she missed him, and still loved him. Frank had gone away to work shifts before. True, such work never brought anything to the family. He always came home drunk. As a rule, he started spending the money he earned on the way to his hometown. Although it was not always possible, but the couple usually called each other. During Frank's departure, they exchanged the latest news and just talked on the same watch. Did anything change? Frank never called Nancy. Neither did she. The resentment against her drinking husband was too strong. She sighed heavily. She wanted to call her husband and tell him all about the new acquaintance, the surgery, and all the changes that had happened to her over the summer. She twirled a cell phone in her hands and tucked it into her pocket. It's getting late, Nancy thought, flinging it skyward. One more mesmerized look and went to bed. Before Friday, they had already done all the necessary tests. Now all that was left to do was wait. Would James be allowed to undergo surgery? Leo's clinic happened to be in a neighboring large city. It was modern and clean, and the doctors seemed very qualified. James, like his mother, was absolutely delighted. He enjoyed looking at everything here. He walked the corridors, happily met the staff, and even made friends with one of the patients. It was a boy the same age as James. Also preparing for the upcoming orthopedic surgery, Nancy was glowing with happiness and prayed to God that the tests came back good and my son had the surgery. "I still can't believe how lucky we are," Christina, who had come to visit them, said to her. "Me too. Wow, I didn't want to talk to Leo at first. I was afraid of him, and I was afraid to talk to just anyone." Nancy answered thoughtfully. "I told you a long time ago. Remember, it's time to make some changes in your life. You see how everything has turned out so well now. Even your mother-in-law, she's here for a reason." "Oh, I don't agree with that." Nancy laughed. "She's been bleeding me dry." By the way, Christina put her cup on the coffee table. "You've already told Frank when he's coming back." Frank said Nancy's husband's name thoughtfully. "Frank, no, I haven't. We haven't spoken since he left." "Nancy," the sister said indignantly. "How can you do that? He is, after all, James's father. He has a duty to know." "You're right, of course you're right." Nancy fixed her clothes and stared blankly out of the window. "So why don't you just sit there? Call him and tell him." "Call him myself." The woman was genuinely surprised. "Of course, we didn't quarrel, but after that obedient conversation, I don't know what to think." "You won't know until you get up the courage to call," Christina parried. "Calls come on." Nancy reluctantly pulled out her phone and decided to call her husband after all. Whatever kind of relationship were they in, Christina was right. He had to be aware of the upcoming surgery. James. She selected the right contact, pressed the call button. It buzzed. He didn't answer the call. The woman put the phone away, looked at her sister. She understood without words. "No answer, no answer," Nancy said. And resentment began to choke her again. "I think this is the end. What end? Christina raised her eyebrows indignantly. Come on, don't get so worked up. As you can see, Clara, by all appearances, succeeded in her plan. She divorced us. Nancy sighed sadly. She didn't know whether she should be sad or happy. But then the phone rang. Frank calling back. With hope in his voice, Christina asked. Nancy glanced at the cell phone screen. Her eyes lit up. It was Leo. Hello. She quickly answered the call. After a few seconds, a smile of joy lit up her face. Yes, thank you. Nancy counted into the receiver. When she put the phone aside, Christina looked at her sister expectantly. So did the surgery get scheduled? Yes, Nancy smiled broadly. Yes, it's scheduled for the very beginning of September. Nancy. Christina jumped up to her sister and hugged her tightly. How excited am I? She released the woman from the hug and looked at her carefully. You can deal with Frank later. What matters now is our James. Nancy was happier than ever. Finally, at least one of her problems was almost solved. She walked briskly to the yard to find her son and tell him the good news. It was nearing the middle of August, and the first leaves were beginning to fall from the trees. Nancy and her son continued to visit her sister. Nancy, you might say, had finally come to her senses. She herself noticed how she looked better and felt better and better every day. She had almost learned not to be afraid of everything in the world, no longer in perpetual stress. She finally realized that everything in this life should be fought for, not just floating along. James, this vacation was good for him too. He gave up video games on his own, read a lot, and took up sports as much as possible for himself, and recommended by doctors. James was working out hard and preparing for surgery. He dreamed of one day riding a sport bike again. One day, Christina took Nancy shopping and her sisters shopping. Her friends picked out a new closet for her. Christina insisted on it and took all the expenses on herself, saying that was a gift. And so our heroine Fresher rested in beautiful and strong clothes, sat in the living room, and drank coffee waiting for her sister. James came into the room and stopped, leaning on his crutches. He looked at Mom and asked Aunt Christina, "Where is Mom?" I wanted to ask her something. Nancy was taken aback. She looked herself up and scrutinized her son's face. James, what's wrong with you? You don't recognize your mother. A look of intense surprise appeared on the boy's face. He wiped his eyes shut and opened them sharply. Mom, it's you. Who else? Honey, what are you doing? Nancy got up restlessly from the couch and walked over to her son, checking to see if he was okay. The boy looked a little confused. I thought you were Auntie, Christina. Have you become so much like her? Nancy smiled softly. Of course we look alike. We're twins. Well, yeah. James, come closer. I know it's just that you two used to be so different, but now you look exactly the same. The woman smiled and couldn't believe her ears. She was insanely pleased to realize that she looked like her sister again. Nancy remembered how upset she had been when she had seen her the day they arrived. She happily noted to herself that she felt like herself again. Was there something you wanted to ask me? Nancy asked. Do you remember when I used to go out on my own? I met some of the other guys then. Do you mind if I go out alone with them again? There are older boys there. If anything, they'll help me. Nancy still feared for her son, but agreed. She took James' phone numbers from his new friends and told him to give them hers just in case. She finally realized that you can't deprive a child of his childhood, and his illness is not a barrier. You can always find a way out, and not to shake and be afraid of every step. After walking her son to the gate, she returned to the living room. Christina was already there. I thought so. Nancy said to her, It's very nice here, of course, but I have to get on with my life. I can't stay with you forever and live off you. Anyway, it was time for me to go home, find Kevin, and finally deal with my mother-in-law, if we still have her. Nancy's voice trembled. That's right. Sister Christina nodded approvingly. But maybe you can do it later. James is so nice here. I'd love to. But you can't keep dodging problems forever. Are you right? Christina's thinking. Listen, why don't you leave James with me? He and I will work things out just fine. And he told me yesterday that he's made some friends here. Oh, I hadn't really thought about that. Nancy was visibly nervous. She'd never left her sick son unattended in her life. He's not too stressed out. What on earth are you talking about? Christina waved his hands in surprise. You know how much I love my nephews. I'd love to be with James. Go deal with your insufferable mother-in-law. Go find Kevin. I miss him just as much. Nancy thought for a moment. She knew she couldn't put it off any longer, but she didn't want to leave without James. After many minutes of thought, she finally nodded and agreed to her sister's suggestion. You're right. I'll go home tomorrow. And I don't think James would mind staying here. Christina looked at her face. How's it going, sis? Keep it that way. Nancy was standing at the gate. James, when he heard that his mother was coming back, had offered to leave him with his aunt. He was glad when he found out that Mom had already made that decision. Now the son and his sister came out to see her off. They hugged each other tightly, and Nancy was just about to go out. But James called out to her, Mom, wait. The boy approached the woman and looked her seriously in the eye. Can you get Kevin out? I'm so anxious to get him back to the way he used to be. Nancy was immensely surprised at her son's words. After all, the brothers had been getting along very badly lately. She put her hand on his shoulder and answered just as seriously. Yes, I promise, kissed her son on the forehead and started down the road towards the station. A serious conversation with her mother-in-law was waiting for her on the train. On her way home, she tried calling her eldest son again, but all in vain. The teenager was still not answering the phone. The situation was the same with her husband. The woman did not dare to call her mother-in-law. She thought it would be better to talk to her face to face. When she finally reached her entrance, she suddenly realized that she was still afraid and did not want to plunge back into her problems. What if the mother-in-law has already rented our apartment to someone? The woman thought, what if Frank is there with some woman? What if the worst guesses were worse than the worst? Tortured Nancy. Finally exhaling and pulling herself together, she went up to her floor. Barely opening the door, she stood still in horror. She was startled by the harsh listening noise coming from the apartment, from her own apartment business. She didn't know what to think. Opening the door with a quick step, she stepped inside and stopped like a stumble. The place was a complete mess. Right in the hallway stood a stepladder from the wall, collected wallpaper. All around in some paint cans. It took the woman a few seconds to realize that her apartment was being renovated. Her mother-in-law's voice came from the kitchen. Still ringing and annoying, Nancy shook her head, shaking off her shock, almost hitting a paint can with her foot. She walked into the kitchen and experienced an even greater shock. Standing next to the window was Kevin, her oldest missing son. He was holding a large paint roller. He was painting the ceiling with confident strokes. Clara, sitting nearby, whom Nancy hadn't noticed in the midst of this spectacular sight, called out to Nancy, "It's you?" Asked her mother-in-law. Her tone was one of joy and genuine surprise. "I don't recognize you. I thought Kevin, your age, had come to see us." Clara laughed loudly as usual. Kevin turned around, smiled, and said, "Hi, Mom." Nancy couldn't believe her eyes. Her oldest son was alive and well and looking better than ever, and yet he was at home doing repairs. "Where were you? Why didn't you answer?" "I could barely get it out. My mother was dumbfounded too. I was here. My grandmother and I are making repairs, and my grandmother turns out to be a real piece of work. World history. Odds." Kevin looked proudly at his grandmother, and the latter did not stay in debt and winked at him in a cocky way. He didn't answer. Kevin continued his monologue. "At first she just didn't want to talk, and then I lost the phone. How are you? How's it going?" Nancy came closer to the goats, looked at her son closer. Surely he's not a trick of the eye. Nothing wrong with him. Just in case, she gingerly touched his leg. She couldn't reach any lower. "Everything is fine," Nancy smiled cheerfully. "I come with good news to add to the conversation," cutting Clara. Well, well, what's the news?" "James is having surgery in September," Nancy said excitedly, not hiding her pride. "And it's free." "Nancy, I can't believe what I'm hearing." Clara rose from her stool in delight. "But how?" Her daughter-in-law smiled modestly and answered her, "I'll tell you all about it later. It's a long story. James and I just made some useful acquaintances." Clara nodded. Nancy caught herself thinking that her mother-in-law looked as if she knew it would be like this. Clara said, giving her voice an instructive tone, "See, all it took was a little change in your habits and some rest." She looked at the kitchen. "All right, you can tell me all about it later. In the meantime, you look at what the little one and I have already managed to do." The woman came out of the kitchen, beckoning her daughter-in-law to follow her. Together, they proceeded to the bathroom. Seeing what became Nancy here, thought she had fallen into a fairy tale. She simply did not recognize her bathroom. The sink was new, perfectly clean. The once so annoying to Nancy shabby pipes were gone. In their place was a new silver towel drying rack. The bathroom itself was lined with shiny coffee tiles and a dimly dull light bulb. Shade-less lampshades were replaced with bright, spotlights. The once shabby and dirty green walls were done and painted above the tile in a nice color. Nancy on the favorite. By the way, everything was so fresh, so clean. The restroom adjacent to the bathroom had been given a complete makeover too. A new toilet bowl, tiles smooth and fresh, painted walls, a neat hanging cabinet for household supplies. Nancy simply stopped comprehending what was happening. She only asked quietly, glancing at her mother-in-law, Clara, "How is that so much money? Who put that nonsense in your head?" "The one with the smirk." The woman asked. "I withdrew a little from my savings account. We live frugally in the village, we have our own money. But it's not as expensive as it may seem. We spend only on consumables and plumbing, and that's the simplest one we took, and everything else we did ourselves with our own hands." Clara put her palms forward, as if demonstrating the truthfulness of her words. "Come on, I'll show you something else. We've already changed the wallpaper in the nursery. No offense, but we're not in the bathroom yet. We're sleeping in your bedroom with Frank." "What do you mean, Clara?" Nancy said with delight. And she added, "How did you get my Kevin to participate in the renovation? I couldn't even get him home for the last 6 months. And you have to have a different approach for each one." The mother-in-law began to lecture her daughter-in-law again. But this time Nancy didn't mind it at all. She listened attentively to her brave relative as she proudly boasted of the new renovation. As Nancy drove back to town, all sorts of terrifying scenarios swirled in her mind. She imagined her husband having an affair with his mistress. She imagined Kevin setting up a real brothel in the apartment. She imagined many things, but she couldn't imagine her mother-in-law making the renovations she had dreamed of and bringing her eldest son home. Nancy was over the moon. She quickly changed her clothes and started to help her family with the renovation. Together, they finished sawing the ceilings and painted the walls in the kitchen and glued special panels on the apron of the kitchen set, which, by the way, changed the fronts. Mother-in-law found somewhere on the sale, as she said, for pennies a little used knot and previous owner's oak fronts. Yes, from the very real fresh smooth oak. The miracles continued. Over the next few days, the renovation of the apartment continued in full swing. Nancy watched Kevin cautiously at first, trying to see if his son was off drugs and alcohol. When she was convinced that her son was completely sober and was preparing to pass his tails at school to move up to the next grade, she almost lost her mind. The overjoyed mother wanted to ask Kevin about everything. How he had managed to quit his bad habits, how he had decided to leave his awful company. But Nancy was afraid to alienate her newly found eldest son. With unnecessary questioning, she was happy to communicate with both Kevin and her mother-in-law. And the repairs were no burden at all. One warm evening, Nancy, suddenly remembering that she was on her way to find out about her mother-in-law, sincerely apologized to her. "For God's sake, Clara, I apologize for accusing you then without reason?" Guiltily, said the daughter-in-law. She now really thought that she had just heard that phrase. The mother-in-law graciously forgave her suspicious daughter-in-law. "I understand. She's Nancy. You were creepy back then, weren't you? What tired looking. Scary, by God." She answered her, and both women cried and hugged each other tightly. During these few days in the joyful bustle and cares, Nancy suddenly realized that her mother-in-law was not at all such a nasty old woman. Yes, she was a little peculiar, of course, but not mean at all. Now Nancy was anxious to ask Clara about her husband. Where he was, why he wasn't answering his phone, but she didn't dare. Embarrassed. After a few more days, Nancy felt that it was time for her to return to work. No matter how well her life was going, she still needed the money. And she missed her clinic, her colleagues, and even her patients. She had warned George in advance that she would be coming to work soon. Nancy was already standing at the reception desk. Lily, the receptionist, did not recognize a colleague. So nice and fresh. And Nancy looked. How nice to see you. George greeted his assistant with joy. He carefully pulled out a chair in front of her so the woman could sit down. He walked over and sat at his desk. You look great, just great. The man left approvingly. Thank you. With gratitude in her voice, Nancy replied. She changed a little, but dared to say what she was thinking. You know, I was angry with you at first, terribly angry. But you were so right about everything. I really needed that vacation. Sure, it took a little longer, but I really got more rest than ever and solved a lot of my problems. I can see that very well. I see it now, the doctor replied, smiling broadly. Like children. Like a young son. George, you won't believe it. And Nancy told the supervisor everything that had happened to her in the last 2.5 months. The dentist listened to his assistant attentively and occasionally asked clarifying questions. It was obvious how genuinely happy he was for her. Now that you have rested, fully regained your strength, I have to confess to you, said the doctor, a little embarrassed. What's the matter? Nancy moved forward, expressing concern. It's that my temporary assistant is an idiot. The doctor laughed good-naturedly. I've missed you as a professional and as a friend too. I hope you will be able to take up your duties very soon. Nancy went back to work. Her attentiveness was enviable. Each of the patients again, as before, noted the woman's neatness, her carefulness, and her focus on her work. Her mother-in-law and her son-in-law, who had successfully passed all the transfer exams, were waiting for her at home. Her eldest son. The renovation was slowly coming to an end. In the evenings after work, the woman helped her loved ones and cooked something delicious under the careful guidance of attentive Clara. And on the next weekend, she went to her sister's villa to check on her youngest son and share the latest news. When Nancy returned back to the apartment, she caught sight of a man's shoes in the hallway. They were her husband Frank's shoes. The woman walked breathlessly into the kitchen. Nancy's soul of mine, Frank, broke out in a wide smile. His eyes shone. He looked better than ever, and most importantly, he was completely sober. Frank, Nancy was at a loss for words. How are you? How's your work? Fine, the man replied, proudly raising his chin. Nancy, how good do you look, as good as you did 20 years ago? Frank moved closer to his wife and hugged her tightly. The woman stood motionless. She couldn't believe that her Frank was completely sober. For the past few years, he had never returned from a watch so fresh and trim. Such a turnaround was a true miracle for the family. She said quietly and shocked as why did you what happened? Frank laughed. It's like this. I don't drink at all anymore. And he hesitated. Quickly walked out of the room and just as quickly came back in. This is for you. Smiling broadly, he bore his wife a gift box. At this, Nancy opened the present with interest and was surprised to find there a new bright, ceremonial clothes and a small jewelry box. The woman opened it and marveled. Inside were small gold gems with some kind of green pebble at the base. But how do you like it? The man asked with a gasp. I do. Nancy covered her mouth with her hand in admiration. She hugged her husband and poked him on his clean-shaven cheek. She ran off to try on her new earrings. Frank, who had followed her, continued talking, and also this to Vanya. I bought new sneakers, James. I want to give you a new computer, but I don't have enough money. And also a beautiful red dress. The woman took an example of earrings and immersed herself in front of the mirror. Then she turned to her husband and slowly walked in front of him, modeling gait. The couple laughed in unison. Nancy, not hiding her curiosity, asked, Why have you changed so much? I've been praying for you for so long. And now it's so easy. Frank laughed again. Well, I've got a steady job now, a good one. I'm not a fool to push through an opportunity like that. And when my wife is so beautiful, kind, affectionate, how can you trade her for alcohol? He took Nancy's hands and pulled her to him. In fact, ask my mother, you shouldn't have disliked her. He winked slyly at his wife and left the room. Nancy thought deeply. What did he mean by that? She turned back to her family on the wall and surveyed the newly renovated kitchen as if anew. Clean, smooth walls, new kitchen cabinetry. Even the refrigerator was new, big, spacious. Nancy had always thought appliances were very, very expensive, but the wise Clara suggested that they could be bought cheaper. For example, a used but still decent item, or you could pick up a good discount at the store. Nancy couldn't. She looked at her apartment, at her family, and still couldn't believe everything had worked out so well. She looked at her mother-in-law carefully. She was laughing, telling an old joke to her grandson. Nancy noted to herself that her mother-in-law's loud voice was not at all obnoxious, and the jokes were silly. Clara noticed her attentive gaze and came closer. I see you want to ask something. She smiled slyly. Okay, you can ask your questions. Let's go out on the balcony. Let's not disturb our men. The women quietly went out of the kitchen. When the balcony and the door closed, Nancy immediately pounced on her mother-in-law with questions. How did you manage all this? Frank promised you would tell me what you did. Share. Repair Kevin. Sober Frank, I don't understand. Clara laughed out loud. I realized a long time ago, my dear, that there was something wrong here, didn't I? The last time Frank came to see me, I knew right away. There's trouble in my son's family. What's next? The woman asked quietly. What? I had to take matters into my own hands. I don't know your character. Don't take offense, but you're too softly warm, daughter, and not flexible at all. I came here to give you a real beating. I'm sorry again for what I said to you, but you really needed to go away and get some rest. But how did you know I was going on vacation? I could have gone anywhere. Nancy asked. Clara laughed merrily again. I'm telling you, knowing you like the back of my hand. Where else would you have gone? And your sister? A wise woman, I know. She wouldn't give you bad advice. Look what you've become. And all you had to do was nothing. Why? That way you could have just said, oh really? My mother-in-law's hands are splayed. I never told you. You did every time we called, but you didn't listen. I mean, you did. I didn't really hear you. So I had to do it on the sly. And I faked that conversation too. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't hear that, Nancy said in surprise. Yes, and slyness itself. Nancy smiled broadly. But how did you wean Kevin off the drugs? How did you do it? How? Did you have to act like you did? Tricky. Later, Clara smiled. I told him that some beautiful girl was looking for him, that she'd made a date with him and given him the address. There was no pretty girl, the woman inquired. Good point. And the address was an addiction clinic, the one at the church. There I showed him when he arrived what could happen to him if he didn't quit that stuff, and then I arranged for his treatment. He was there for a month and a half, which is why he hasn't returned your calls. They're not allowed to use the phones there. Believe me, dear Kevin, I get it. He'll keep studying and everything will be fine now. Just one thing. Nancy looked at her mother-in-law with undisguised admiration, and that I promised my grandson I'd have a serious talk with you both. Tell me, why are you forcing him to study economics? Kevin's dream is to go to gymnastics school. You know how much he loves soccer, right? I know, but no. But my mother-in-law interrupted Nancy. Just because you don't like your kids' choices doesn't mean they're wrong. You're right. No matter how short-sighted you think he is right now, it's his life, you know? It's his own, and he has to choose his own path. And you and Frank should just go along with it, help support him. Everybody has their place in this life, honey. And success can only be achieved by doing what you love. Nancy thought deeply. She was well aware that her mother-in-law was more right than ever. But it was hard for her to admit it out loud, so she only asked quietly what about Frank. And Frank was the easiest to guide to the true path. Why was he drinking? Because he wasn't happy. I promised him that very soon you and his wife would stop being such a bun and start supporting him. You will. Of course I will. Good for you. Our parishioners helped me find him a job. One of them has a rich relative who needed a reliable security guard. I told my son that this job was his only and last chance to get his life together. You see, now on that tender wife, happy children, a favorite house and a job is all he needs to be happy in America. And he's not the only one. It's not much at all, is it really? You're right about everything. I'm sorry again. So how did you help James? Who is this Leo of ours, really? Nancy's mother-in-law laughed out loud. You're the one who helped James. I had nothing to do with it. Although, if you want my opinion, I think it's your new temper. Tell me before, you would never ever talk to a stranger. You see, it can be good to relax a little, put things in perspective. You're right. Thank you, dear Mom. Nancy, without hiding her emotions, threw herself into Clara's arms. Now she couldn't believe that her mother-in-law's once-hated visit had transformed her life. You're welcome, daughter. It's been almost a year since the events described above. James, the operation was a success. The boy recovered easily and was able to walk again without crutches. Like all normal children, he started to go to school. He had a lot of new friends and new hobbies. Kevin finished 11th grade very well. Not without a C, right? But we can't all be great at math, as the family joked. And he entered, as he dreamed, the physical education school on a budgetary basis perfectly prepared. He passed all the necessary standards, just brilliantly. Passion for sports helped him to meet a good and simple girl, and the old company and bad habits the guy forgot forever. Frank, in turn, completely abandoned drinking. He worked hard, was well regarded by his superiors, and by the end of his first year, he was promoted to shift supervisor at an important facility. Nancy was happy. She worked at her pleasure, did the household chores, spoiled her sons and husband with various goodies. The family had paid back all their debts and were now living in complete prosperity. The happy family now divided the summer into two parts. The first half they spent at Christina's villa, and the second half in the village, at her parents' at Frank. It turns out that to be happy is very simple. The main thing is to be open, optimistic, and necessarily able to love. It is important not to put your hands down and be able to look at your problems from different sides. Such qualities will definitely be rewarded. After all, the main thing in life is to be able to this very life and really enjoy it.